The vast expanse of the Pontic steppes in the 3rd century AD witnessed the crystallization of one of history's most formidable Germanic confederations. Along the fertile banks of the Dnieper River, the Greuthungi emerged as a distinct political and cultural entity, their settlements stretching across the rich black earth that would sustain their growing population and ambitious warrior aristocracy. These Gothic peoples, while sharing linguistic and cultural roots with their western cousins, the Tervingi, developed their own unique identity shaped by the geographical realities of their eastern homeland and the complex web of relationships with neighbouring steppe peoples. The Greuthungi Confederation differed markedly from the Tervingi in both territorial organisation and political structure, where the Tervingi, later known as Visigoths, concentrated their power in the forested regions between the Dniester and Danube rivers. The Greuthungi controlled the more expansive territories extending eastward toward the Don River. This geographical distinction proved crucial in shaping their respective destinies. The Greuthungi's eastern position placed them at the crossroads of multiple trade routes connecting the Black Sea with the interior of the continent, while simultaneously exposing them to the influence of various nomadic peoples who had long dominated the steppes. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Chernyakov reveals the sophisticated material culture that emerged within Greuthungi territories during this period. Their settlements displayed a remarkable degree of organisation, with substantial timber-framed houses arranged in planned communities that could accommodate several hundred inhabitants. These structures, often measuring up to 20 metres in length, featured stone hearths, storage areas, and workshops where skilled artisans produced the distinctive metalwork that would become synonymous with Gothic craftsmanship. The presence of specialised craft quarters within these settlements indicates a level of social stratification and economic complexity that went far beyond simple tribal organisation. The warrior culture that defined Greuthungi society manifested itself most clearly in their burial practices and material assemblages. Elite graves from this period contain elaborate weapon sets, including long iron swords with distinctive ring pommels, broad-bladed spears, and shield bosses decorated with intricate geometric patterns. These weapons were not merely functional tools, but symbols of status and identity, often featuring silver and gold inlays that demonstrated both the wealth of their owners and the technical sophistication of Gothic metalworkers. The quality of these artefacts rivaled contemporary Roman military equipment, suggesting that Gothic smiths had either learned advanced techniques through contact with imperial craftsmen, or had developed their own innovative methods. Women's burials reveal equally impressive displays of wealth and artistry, with elaborate fibulae, neck rings, and belt fittings crafted from precious metals and adorned with garnets, amber, and other semi-precious stones. These grave goods indicate not only the high status of elite women within Gothic society, but also the extensive trade networks that brought exotic materials from across Europe and beyond. Amber from the Baltic, garnets from India, and silk from China found their way into Gothic burial assemblages, demonstrating the Confederation's integration into continental and even transcontinental exchange systems. The development of distinctive Gothic artistic styles during this period reflected both indigenous traditions and external influences absorbed through contact with diverse neighbouring cultures. Gothic metalworkers perfected techniques for creating polychrome jewellery using the cloisonner method, where thin gold cells held precisely cut gemstones in intricate patterns. This style, which would later influence artistic traditions across medieval Europe, represented a fusion of Germanic craftsmanship with decorative motifs borrowed from steppe nomads and Mediterranean civilizations. Initial contacts between the Greuthungi and the Roman Empire occurred through multiple channels, each contributing to the complex relationship that would define Gothic-Roman interactions for centuries. Trade represented perhaps the most significant early connection, with Gothic merchants exchanging furs, amber, slaves, and agricultural products for Roman-manufactured goods, wine, and luxury items. Roman coins found in Gothic archaeological contexts demonstrate the extent of this commercial relationship. While the presence of Roman glassware, bronze vessels and pottery in elite Gothic burials indicates that Roman goods had become important status symbols within Gothic society. Diplomatic relations developed alongside commercial exchanges, as Roman authorities recognized the need to manage relationships with powerful barbarian confederations along their extended frontiers. The Greuthungi, like other Gothic groups, provided both opportunities and challenges for Roman frontier policy. Their military strength made them valuable potential allies, but their territorial ambitions and warrior culture also posed constant threats to imperial security. Roman diplomats worked to maintain delicate balances, offering subsidies, official recognition, and military cooperation agreements to Gothic leaders willing to serve imperial interests. Border conflicts along the Danube frontier punctuated these generally peaceful interactions, as Gothic raiding parties tested Roman defences and sought opportunities for plunder and territorial expansion. These conflicts, while often limited in scope, provided Gothic warriors with valuable combat experience and exposed them to Roman military tactics and equipment. The raids also served important social functions within Gothic society, allowing young warriors to prove themselves and ambitious leaders to build the followings through successful military ventures. The Roman response to Gothic pressure varied depending on imperial circumstances and the personalities of frontier commanders. Some officials pursued aggressive military campaigns designed to punish Gothic raiders and demonstrate Roman strength. Others preferred diplomatic solutions, using subsidies and alliance agreements to channel Gothic military energy toward threats to imperial interests. These varying approaches created a complex pattern of conflict and cooperation that shaped the development of Gothic political structures and military capabilities. The arrival of Hunnic peoples in the Pontic steppes during the latter half of the 4th century fundamentally altered the political landscape that had nurtured Greuthungi development. The Huns, with their superior cavalry tactics and ruthless military efficiency, posed an existential threat to established Gothic power structures. Unlike previous steppe nomads, who had generally been absorbed into existing political arrangements or had established tributary relationships with Gothic confederations, the Huns sought complete domination of the region and its resources. Hunnic military pressure forced the Greuthungi to confront difficult choices about their political future and cultural identity. Some Gothic groups submitted to Hunnic authority, providing military service in exchange for protection and continued local autonomy. Others attempted to maintain independence through military resistance or strategic migration to territories beyond Hunnic reach. These decisions, made under extreme duress, would have lasting consequences for the development of distinct Gothic identities and the ultimate fate of different Gothic populations. The gradual formation of a specifically Ostrogothic identity emerged from this crucible of Hunnic pressure and political fragmentation. While the term Ostrogoth itself would not appear in historical sources until later periods, the cultural and political foundations of this identity were established during the crisis of the late 4th century. Gothic groups that remained in the East, whether under Hunnic domination or in precarious independence, began to develop distinct characteristics that would differentiate them from their Western cousins who had migrated across the Danube into Roman territory. This emerging Ostrogothic identity incorporated elements of traditional Gothic culture while adapting to new political and military realities imposed by Hunnic dominance. The warrior ethos that had always characterized Gothic society took on new dimensions as Gothic military leaders learned to operate within Hunnic command structures while maintaining their own cultural traditions and political aspirations. The result was a hybrid culture that retained distinctively Gothic elements while incorporating steppe military practices and political concepts that would prove crucial for later Ostrogothic success. The material culture of Gothic groups under Hunnic influence reflected these complex cultural negotiations. Archaeological evidence from this period shows continued production of traditional Gothic artefacts alongside adoption of Hunnic-style weapons and horse equipment. Gothic craftsmen adapted their techniques to produce composite bows, scale armour, and other military equipment associated with steppe warfare, while maintaining their expertise in traditional metalworking and decorative arts. This technological synthesis created the material foundation for the military effectiveness that would characterise later Ostrogothic armies. The social structures that emerged during this period of transition combined Gothic aristocratic traditions with new forms of military organisation learned through service in Hunnic armies. Gothic nobles who successfully navigated the challenges of Hunnic domination often emerged with enhanced military skills and broader political perspectives that would serve them well in later independent ventures. The experience of operating within multi-ethnic military confederations under Hunnic leadership provided valuable lessons in managing diverse populations and coordinating complex military campaigns. The catastrophe that befell the Greuthungi Confederation in 375 AD marked one of the most decisive moments in early medieval European history. The Hunnic assault, led by a king whose identity remains shrouded in scholarly debate but whom some sources identify as Balamber, struck with the devastating efficiency that would become the hallmark of steppe warfare. The attack came not as a single overwhelming blow, but as a coordinated campaign that systematically dismantled the political and military structures that had sustained Gothic power in the Pontic steppes for over a century. The Hunnic military machine that descended upon the Greuthungi represented a revolutionary approach to warfare that the Goths were unprepared to counter. Unlike the infantry-heavy tactics that dominated Germanic military thinking, the Huns deployed massed cavalry formations armed with powerful composite bows capable of accurate fire at ranges exceeding 300 metres. These warriors, mounted on hardy steppe ponies bred for endurance and speed, could strike with lightning rapidity and withdraw before their enemies could organise effective counterattacks. The psychological impact of their tactics proved as devastating as the physical destruction they wrought, as Gothic warriors accustomed to close-quarters combat found themselves unable to close with an enemy that seemed to materialise from nowhere and vanish like smoke. The Greuthungi king Ermanaric, whose reign had represented the pinnacle of Gothic power in the east, found his confederation crumbling under the relentless Hunnic pressure. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Dnieper basin shows clear signs of violent destruction during this period, with burned settlements and hastily buried hoards of precious objects marking the path of Hunnic conquest. The speed of the collapse suggests that the Huns had identified and exploited critical weaknesses in Gothic military organisation, possibly through intelligence gathered during earlier diplomatic contacts, or through defections from Gothic subject peoples who saw opportunity in the changing political landscape. The subjugation process that followed the initial military victories demonstrated the sophisticated political strategies that underlay Hunnic success. Rather than simply destroying Gothic society, the Huns implemented a system of controlled domination that preserved existing social hierarchies while ensuring absolute political submission. Gothic nobles who submitted were permitted to retain their positions and much of their wealth, but only as subordinates within a larger Hunnic imperial structure. This approach proved remarkably effective in maintaining stability, while extracting maximum military and economic benefit from conquered populations. The integration of Ostrogothic warriors into Hunnic military forces began almost immediately after the conquest. The Huns recognised the combat effectiveness of Gothic heavy infantry and cavalry, viewing them as valuable assets rather than merely defeated enemies. Gothic warriors brought skills in siege warfare, metalworking and organised battlefield tactics that complemented Hunnic mobility and archery. This military synthesis created combined forces that were more formidable than either group could have fielded independently. The transformation of Gothic military culture under Hunnic influence involved fundamental changes in equipment, tactics, and organisation. Gothic warriors learned to use composite bows, a technology that required years of training to master effectively. The construction of these weapons involved laminating horn, sinew and wood in precise configurations that could generate tremendous power while remaining compact enough for mounted use. Gothic craftsmen adapted their metalworking skills to produce the specialised arrowheads, thumb rings and other archery equipment necessary for steppe warfare. Mounted combat became increasingly important in Gothic military practice, though the transition was gradual and uneven across different social groups. Elite Gothic warriors had always maintained horses for transportation and prestige, but the systematic use of cavalry in coordinated battlefield roles represented a significant tactical evolution. The Huns provided instruction in horse breeding, training techniques, and mounted combat formations that transformed Gothic military capabilities. Archaeological evidence shows increasing numbers of horse burials and riding equipment in Gothic graves from this period, indicating the growing importance of equestrian skills in Gothic warrior culture. The political structures that emerged during the period of Hunnic domination reflected a complex blending of Gothic aristocratic traditions with steppe imperial concepts. Gothic nobles found themselves operating within a hierarchical system that extended far beyond their traditional tribal boundaries, encompassing dozens of different ethnic groups under unified Hunnic command. This exposure to imperial-scale political organisation provided valuable experience that would later influence Ostrogothic state-building efforts. Intermarriage between Gothic and Hunnic elites became an important mechanism for political integration and cultural exchange. These unions, often arranged for diplomatic purposes, created kinship networks that transcended ethnic boundaries and facilitated cooperation between different groups within the Hunnic confederation. The children of these marriages grew up bilingual and bicultural, serving as natural intermediaries between Gothic and Hunnic communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that these mixed families often maintained distinct burial practices that combined elements from both cultural traditions. The adoption of steppe administrative practices by Gothic leaders involved learning new methods of taxation, military recruitment, and territorial organisation. The Huns maintained sophisticated systems for extracting tribute from subject peoples while managing the complex logistics of maintaining large mobile armies. Gothic administrators who proved capable in these roles often found themselves managing territories and populations far from their original homelands, gaining experience in governing diverse ethnic groups with different cultural practices and economic systems. Cultural adaptation during this period extended beyond military and political spheres to encompass religious and artistic traditions. Gothic craftsmen began incorporating Hunnic decorative motifs into their metalwork, creating hybrid artistic styles that reflected their changing cultural environment. The famous polychrome jewellery tradition that would later characterise Ostrogothic material culture evolved during this period through the fusion of Germanic cloison techniques with steppe artistic preferences for animal motifs and dynamic compositions. The role of Ostrogothic forces in Hunnic military campaigns became increasingly prominent as their integration into the Confederation deepened. By the early 5th century, Gothic contingents formed substantial portions of Hunnic armies, providing heavy infantry support and siege capabilities that complemented Hunnic cavalry tactics. These forces participated in campaigns across a vast geographical range, from the Caucasus Mountains to the Rhine frontier, gaining military experience and cultural exposure that would prove invaluable in later independent operations. The invasion of Gaul in 451 AD represented the culmination of Hunnic military power and the most significant deployment of Ostrogothic forces under foreign command. Attila's decision to launch this massive campaign reflected both the internal pressures within the Hunnic Confederation and the strategic opportunities presented by Roman political instability. The army that crossed the Rhine included substantial Ostrogothic contingents under their own nobles, who had spent decades learning to coordinate their tactics with Hunnic cavalry and other allied forces. The Ostrogothic warriors who marched into Gaul bore little resemblance to their ancestors who had faced the initial Hunnic conquest. Generations of military service had transformed them into professional soldiers capable of operating effectively in diverse tactical roles. Their equipment combined traditional Gothic weapons and armour with steppe innovations, creating distinctive military kits that reflected their unique cultural position within the Hunnic confederation. Scale armour, composite bows, and curved sabres appeared alongside traditional Germanic spears, shields, and long swords. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the Hunnic military system that had dominated European warfare for nearly 8 decades. The massive engagement which pitted Attila's forces against a Roman Visigothic coalition under Aetius revealed the tactical sophistication that Hunnic armies had achieved through decades of combined operations. Ostrogothic contingents fought alongside Hunnic cavalry, Gepid infantry, and warriors from dozens of other subject peoples in a coordinated battle plan that nearly achieved complete victory despite facing determined opposition. The death of Attila in 453 AD created an immediate succession crisis that exposed the fundamental instability underlying Hunnic imperial structure. The great king's sons lacked both their father's military reputation and his political acumen, while the various subject peoples who had served under Hunnic domination began to reassess their positions within the confederation. The Ostrogoths, who had maintained their distinct identity and military organisation throughout the period of subjugation, found themselves uniquely positioned to exploit the emerging power vacuum. The rebellion that culminated in the Battle of Nidau in 454 AD represented a coordinated effort by multiple subject peoples to break free from Hunnic control. The Ostrogoths, led by members of the Amal dynasty who had carefully preserved their legitimacy throughout the period of foreign rule, played a crucial role in organising the anti-Hunnic coalition. Their military expertise, gained through decades of service in Hunnic armies, proved instrumental in developing tactics capable of countering traditional steppe warfare methods. The battle itself took place along the Nidau River, possibly the Netava in modern-day Hungary, where the rebel coalition achieved a decisive victory that effectively ended Hunnic dominance in Central Europe. Ostrogothic heavy cavalry, supported by Gepid and other allied forces, successfully charged Hunnic formations that had been disrupted by coordinated archery volleys. The tactical innovations developed during their period of subjugation allowed the Ostrogoths to turn Hunnic military methods against their former masters. The victory at Nidau liberated not only the Ostrogoths but dozens of other peoples who had been incorporated into the Hunnic confederation. The collapse of Hunnic power created opportunities for territorial expansion and political reorganisation that would reshape the ethnic map of Central and Eastern Europe. For the Ostrogoths specifically, independence meant the chance to establish their own kingdom while retaining the military and administrative skills they had developed during 8 decades of foreign rule. The aftermath of Nidau created a power vacuum across the Pannonian plains that ambitious Gothic leaders rushed to fill. Among the Amal nobles who had preserved their royal bloodline through the decades of Hunnic domination, none possessed greater potential than the infant born around 454 AD to King Theodemir. This child, named Theodoric after his grandfather, entered a world where Gothic independence had been violently reclaimed but remained precariously balanced between resurgent tribal ambitions and the ever-present threat of Roman intervention. Theodemir's position within the fractured post-Hunnic landscape required careful navigation between multiple competing interests. The Ostrogothic confederation that emerged from Nidau controlled territories stretching across modern-day Hungary and parts of Serbia, but their authority faced constant challenges from rival Gothic claimants, aggressive neighbours like the Gepids, and the complex diplomatic machinations of both Eastern and Western Roman courts. The elder Theodoric had established his credentials through military leadership during the liberation struggle, but maintaining power required different skills than those needed for rebellion. The Ostrogothic settlements that took shape during Theodoric's early childhood reflected the military realities of their precarious independence. Archaeological evidence from sites like Apahida reveals fortified compounds where Gothic nobles maintained armed retinues ready for immediate deployment. These installations combined traditional Germanic long halls with defensive features learned during the Hunnic period, including earthwork fortifications and strategically positioned horse corrals that could support rapid cavalry deployment. The material culture found in these sites demonstrates the continued fusion of Gothic and steppe traditions, with elaborate metalwork incorporating both Germanic animal motifs and the geometric patterns favoured by nomadic craftsmen. Young Theodoric's education during his earliest years took place within this militarised environment, where the skills necessary for survival included not only traditional aristocratic accomplishments, but also the complex diplomatic awareness required to navigate relationships with multiple Roman courts. Gothic nobles who had served in Hunnic administration brought sophisticated understanding of imperial politics to bear on their children's upbringing, recognising that future success would depend as much on political acumen as military prowess. The boy learned to speak Gothic, Latin, and probably some Greek from an early age, while absorbing the intricate protocols that governed interactions between barbarian kings and Roman officials. The decision to send 7-year-old Theodoric to Constantinople as a hostage around 461 AD represented a calculated gamble by his father Theodomir. The arrangement, negotiated with Emperor Leo I, provided security guarantees for Ostrogothic territories in exchange for the young prince's residence at the imperial court. Such hostage arrangements had become standard diplomatic practice, allowing both sides to demonstrate good faith while providing the Romans with leverage over barbarian behaviour. For Theodoric personally, the arrangement offered unprecedented access to the highest levels of Roman political and military culture. The Constantinople that welcomed young Theodoric was arguably the most sophisticated city in the contemporary world, a metropolis of perhaps 400,000 inhabitants, where the remnants of classical Roman culture blended with Christian theology and the practical demands of governing a vast multi-ethnic empire. The Great Palace complex where Theodoric took up residence covered several acres of prime real estate, overlooking the Bosphorus, its marble halls and mosaic decorations representing the pinnacle of late antique artistic achievement. The contrast with the timber and earthwork compounds of Pannonia must have been overwhelming for a child accustomed to frontier conditions. Imperial court life exposed Theodoric to levels of ceremonial complexity and administrative sophistication that far exceeded anything available in barbarian kingdoms. The elaborate protocols governing imperial audiences, the intricate hierarchy of court officials, and the sophisticated legal procedures that regulated everything from property disputes to military recruitment provided practical lessons in statecraft that no Gothic noble could have learned in their homeland. Daily interactions with senators, generals, and high-ranking clergy gave the young hostage insights into the personalities and motivations that drove imperial policy. The educational curriculum designed for high-ranking hostages included intensive study of classical literature, rhetoric, and military science. Theodoric learned to read and write Latin fluently, studying texts by Caesar, Livy, and Vegetius that provided both historical knowledge and practical guidance for military leadership. His rhetorical training, based on the works of Cicero and Quintilian, taught him to construct persuasive arguments and deliver compelling speeches, skills that would prove invaluable in later diplomatic negotiations. Mathematical and geographical studies provided the technical knowledge necessary for organising large-scale military campaigns and managing complex territorial administrations. Military training within the imperial system exposed Theodoric to tactical concepts and organisational methods that represented centuries of Roman military evolution. The young Gothic prince learned to coordinate infantry and cavalry formations in complex battlefield manoeuvres, to organise siege operations using sophisticated engineering techniques, and to manage the logistical systems that sustained armies operating hundreds of miles from their supply bases. Regular exercises with the palace guard units provided practical experience in commanding disciplined troops trained in Roman methods, while theoretical studies covered everything from fortification design to naval warfare. The religious environment of the imperial court presented Theodoric with his first sustained exposure to Nicene Christianity, though his family's Arian beliefs remained unchanged. The theological debates that occupied much of contemporary intellectual life provided insights into the doctrinal divisions that complicated imperial politics, while the elaborate liturgical ceremonies of Hagia Sophia demonstrated the power of religious symbolism in maintaining imperial authority. These experiences taught Theodoric to navigate religious differences diplomatically while maintaining his own theological convictions. Social interactions with other hostages and young Roman nobles created networks that would influence Theodoric's later career. The imperial court attracted ambitious young men from across the empire and beyond, including Persians, Armenians, and representatives of various barbarian peoples who had negotiated similar arrangements with Constantinople. These relationships provided intelligence about political developments across a vast geographical range while creating potential diplomatic channels for future use. The friendships and rivalries formed during these formative years would resurface decades later in the complex negotiations that characterized late 5th century politics. The return to Pannonia around 471 AD marked Theodoric's transformation from hostage to active participant in Ostrogothic politics. The 20-year-old prince brought with him not only the military and administrative skills acquired through imperial education, but also a sophisticated understanding of Roman strengths and weaknesses that would prove crucial in later campaigns. His father Theodomir had maintained Ostrogothic independence during his son's absence, but the confederation faced mounting pressures from multiple directions that required fresh approaches to survive and prosper. The political landscape that confronted Theodoric upon his return had grown increasingly complex during his decade-long absence. The Ostrogothic confederation competed for territory and influence with the Gepids under their king Ardaric, while Syrian and Rugian tribes controlled strategic positions along the Danube frontier. Meanwhile, other Gothic groups under leaders like Theodoric Strabo had established independent power bases that challenged Amal claims to supremacy over all Gothic peoples. These rivalries created opportunities for Roman manipulation, as imperial diplomats played different barbarian factions against each other to prevent any single group from becoming too powerful. Theodoric's first military commands demonstrated his ability to apply Roman tactical methods to Gothic military traditions. The combined arms formations he developed integrated traditional Gothic heavy infantry with cavalry units trained in steppe warfare techniques learned during the Hunnic period. His forces employed Roman siege equipment and engineering methods, while maintaining the aggressive warrior culture that motivated Gothic soldiers. These innovations proved particularly effective against opponents who expected either purely Roman or purely barbarian tactics. The consolidation of Amal power under Theodoric's leadership required careful balance between military action and diplomatic maneuvering. His campaigns against rival Gothic factions demonstrated superior tactical skills, while his negotiations with Roman officials showed sophisticated understanding of imperial politics. The subsidies and official recognition he secured from Constantinople provided resources for military expansion, while legitimizing Amal claims to leadership over all Ostrogothic peoples. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing standardization of military equipment and burial practices across territories under Amal control, suggesting successful efforts to create unified cultural and political identity. The relationship between Theodoric and Emperor Zeno developed into one of the most complex diplomatic partnerships of the late 5th century. Both leaders recognised their mutual dependence while remaining acutely aware of the potential for conflict between their respective ambitions. Zeno needed Gothic military support to counter threats from usurpers and rival barbarian groups, while Theodoric required imperial recognition and subsidies to maintain his position among competing Gothic factions. Their correspondence, preserved in fragmentary form by contemporary chroniclers, reveals sophisticated diplomatic language that masked underlying tensions while facilitating practical cooperation. The Thracian campaigns of the 470s and 480s showcase Theodoric's ability to operate effectively within imperial strategic frameworks while pursuing distinctly Gothic objectives. His forces served as imperial allies against various threats to Constantinople's Balkan territories, demonstrating tactical flexibility and operational effectiveness that impressed Roman observers. These campaigns provided valuable experience in coordinating with imperial armies, while offering opportunities to recruit additional Gothic warriors and acquire portable wealth through systematic plundering of enemy territories. The complex manoeuvring that characterised Theodoric's relationship with Theodoric Strabo illustrated the sophisticated political calculations required for success in late 5th century barbarian politics. The two Gothic leaders, both named after the same royal ancestor, represented competing visions of Gothic identity and political organisation. Strabo's faction emphasised accommodation with imperial authority and integration into existing Roman administrative structures, while Theodoric the Amal pursued independent kingdom building that would establish Gothic political autonomy. Their rivalry played out through a series of military confrontations and diplomatic negotiations that tested both leaders' abilities to maintain warrior followings while managing relationships with imperial officials. The death of Theodoric Strabo in 481 AD eliminated Theodoric's primary rival for Gothic leadership, while creating opportunities for territorial expansion and political consolidation. The Amal leader moved quickly to incorporate Strabo's followers into his own confederation, offering generous terms to warriors willing to transfer their allegiances while eliminating potential sources of future opposition. This political merger significantly increased Theodoric's military resources while demonstrating his ability to unite previously hostile Gothic factions under unified command. The negotiations that led to Theodoric's commission to invade Italy represented the culmination of decades of careful diplomatic cultivation and military preparation. Emperor Zeno faced the persistent problem of Odoacer's independent kingdom in Italy, which had effectively removed the Western Roman Empire from imperial control while maintaining nominal recognition of Eastern imperial authority. The Gothic solution offered attractive advantages. Theodoric possessed sufficient military strength to challenge Odoacer successfully, while his departure from the Balkans would remove a potentially dangerous concentration of barbarian power from Constantinople's immediate vicinity. The formal arrangements concluded in 489 AD granted Theodoric imperial authorization to conquer Italy and govern it as Zeno's representative, though the precise terms of this agreement remain deliberately ambiguous. Contemporary sources suggest that both parties understood the arrangement differently, with Zeno expecting continued imperial oversight, while Theodoric anticipated practical independence once military objectives had been achieved. This ambiguity allowed both sides to commit to the arrangement while preserving flexibility for future renegotiation based on actual outcomes. The preparations for the Italian expedition demonstrated Theodoric's organisational capabilities and strategic vision. The force he assembled included not only Gothic warriors, but also their families, livestock and portable possessions, indicating his intention to establish permanent settlement rather than conduct temporary military operations. Archaeological evidence suggests that entire communities participated in this migration, bringing craftsmen, clergy, and agricultural specialists necessary for establishing sustainable territorial control. The logistics of moving perhaps 100,000 people across the Alps required sophisticated planning and coordination that drew upon both Roman administrative methods and traditional Germanic migration practices. The massive Gothic host that descended from the Julian Alps in late summer 489 AD represented the culmination of Theodoric's decades-long preparation for independent kingship. The columns stretched for miles across the mountainous terrain, with heavily armed Gothic cavalry riding alongside ox-drawn wagons, carrying families, craftsmen, and the accumulated wealth of an entire people. Theodoric himself rode at the head of this migration, his presence marked by the distinctive royal banner bearing the Amal dynasty's traditional wolf symbol, worked in gold thread against purple silk. The army that followed him numbered approximately 20,000 warriors, supported by auxiliary forces recruited from various allied tribes who had chosen to join the Italian venture rather than remain in the increasingly crowded Balkan territories. The strategic situation that awaited Theodoric in northern Italy had been carefully analysed through intelligence networks established during his years of imperial service. Odoacer's kingdom, while nominally recognising Eastern imperial authority, had operated with practical independence since deposing the last Western Roman emperor in 476 AD. The Germanic king controlled a military force built around Syrian, Rugian and Herulian warriors, supplemented by Roman units that had remained loyal after the collapse of Western imperial administration. These forces, numbering perhaps 25,000 combat-effective troops, were distributed across fortified positions throughout the Italian peninsula, with major concentrations at Ravenna, Milan and Rome itself. Odoacer's defensive strategy relied heavily on controlling the key river crossings and mountain passes that dominated northern Italian geography. The Isonzo River, flowing from the Julian Alps toward the Adriatic, represented the first major obstacle facing Theodoric's advance. Here, Odoacer had positioned substantial forces under his nephew Arnulfus, who commanded a mixed army of Germanic warriors and Roman infantry units, equipped with traditional imperial weapons and armour. The defensive positions established along the river's eastern bank included timber palisades reinforced with earthworks, designed to channel any attacking force into predetermined killing zones where concentrated archery and javelin fire could inflict maximum casualties. The Battle of Isonzo, fought in late August 489 AD, demonstrated Theodoric's ability to adapt Roman tactical methods to Gothic military traditions while exploiting his enemy's strategic assumptions. Rather than attempting a direct frontal assault across the river, Theodoric divided his forces into multiple columns that approached the defensive positions from different directions simultaneously. His cavalry units, trained in the mobility tactics learned during the Hunnist period, conducted diversionary attacks along the southern approaches, while his main infantry force prepared crossing equipment upstream from the primary defensive positions. The Gothic assault began before dawn with concentrated archery fire directed at the timber fortifications. Theodoric's archers, many of whom had mastered composite bow techniques during their service under Hunnic command, maintained accurate fire at ranges that prevented effective retaliation from defenders armed with shorter-range weapons. This suppressive fire allowed Gothic engineers to position portable bridges and fascines at carefully selected crossing points where the river's depth and current conditions favoured rapid deployment of heavy infantry formations. The breakthrough came when Gothic cavalry units successfully forded the river at an unexpected location several miles south of the main defensive line. These mounted warriors, led by Theodoric's most trusted lieutenants, struck the rear of Odoacer's positions, while the main Gothic infantry assault developed across the prepared crossing points. The coordination required for this complex manoeuvre reflected the sophisticated command and control systems that Theodoric had developed through years of imperial military service, where precise timing and communication between separated units often determined campaign outcomes. Arnulfus's forces, caught between converging Gothic attacks, attempted to withdraw in good order toward prepared secondary positions. but the speed of the Gothic advance prevented effective disengagement. The retreat quickly devolved into a rout as Gothic cavalry pursued fleeing infantry across the open terrain beyond the river valley. Archaeological evidence from sites along the probable battle route shows scattered weapon deposits and hastily buried coin hoards, suggesting that the defeat was both sudden and complete. Contemporary chroniclers reported that Anulfus himself barely escaped capture, reaching Odoacer's main army with only a fraction of his original force intact. The victory at Isonzo provided Theodoric with immediate strategic advantages beyond the elimination of organised resistance in northeastern Italy. The captured equipment and supplies significantly augmented Gothic military capabilities, while the psychological impact of defeating Odoacer's nephew demonstrated that the invading army possessed both tactical sophistication and battlefield effectiveness. More importantly, the speed and decisiveness of the victory encouraged local Italian populations to view Theodoric as a credible alternative to Odoacer's increasingly unpopular regime. The advance toward Verona revealed the complex relationship between Gothic military objectives and the political realities of governing a diverse Italian population. As Theodoric's army moved through the fertile plains of the Veneto, his commanders faced constant decisions about how to treat civilian populations whose cooperation would be essential for long-term territorial control. The Gothic king had issued strict orders prohibiting unauthorized plundering and violence against non-combatants, recognizing that his ultimate success depended on convincing Italian landowners and urban populations that Gothic rule would provide stability and security rather than chaos and exploitation. These restraints on military behaviour reflected Theodoric's sophisticated understanding of the administrative challenges involved in governing a complex society with established legal traditions and economic systems. Unlike simple raiding expeditions where immediate plunder represented the primary objective, the Italian campaign aimed at establishing permanent territorial control that would require ongoing cooperation from existing administrative, religious and commercial elites. The discipline maintained by Gothic forces during their advance demonstrated their commanders' ability to subordinate short-term military advantages to longer-term political objectives. The approach to Verona in September 489 AD brought Theodoric face-to-face with Odoacer himself, who had assembled the largest army available for a decisive confrontation. The Germanic king had recognised that allowing the Gothic invasion to proceed unopposed would inevitably result in the loss of his kingdom, making a major battle unavoidable despite the tactical risks involved. Odoacer's position at Verona reflected sound strategic thinking, as the city's location controlled access to the Alpine passes while providing secure communications with his remaining strongholds throughout the peninsula. The armies that confronted each other outside Verona represented two different approaches to organising military force in post-imperial Italy. Odoacer's troops included substantial numbers of Roman infantry units that maintained traditional imperial equipment and formations, supported by Germanic warriors who fought in their ancestral styles with long swords, broad-bladed spears and round shields. This combination had proved effective in earlier campaigns, but it required careful coordination between units with different tactical doctrines and command structures. The mixed nature of Odoacer's army also created potential communication problems, as orders had to be transmitted in multiple languages to ensure comprehension across ethnically diverse formations. Theodoric's forces, by contrast, had achieved greater tactical integration through years of combined training and campaign experience. Gothic warriors equipped with traditional Germanic weapons fought alongside cavalry units trained in steppe warfare techniques, while specialised siege engineers provided capabilities learned through imperial military service. The command structure reflected this integration, with Gothic nobles leading mixed formations that could adapt their tactics to changing battlefield conditions without requiring complex coordination between separate ethnic contingents. The Battle of Verona, fought on September 30th, 489 AD, began with extended archery exchanges as both armies tested their opponents' defensive formations. Odoacer's forces, deployed in traditional Roman battle order with infantry in the centre and cavalry on the flanks, initially held their positions effectively against Gothic probing attacks. However, Theodoric's tactical flexibility soon became apparent as his commanders shifted their formations to exploit weaknesses in the enemy deployment. Gothic cavalry units, operating with the mobility learned during their service under Hunnic command, repeatedly struck at exposed flanks before withdrawing beyond the range of effective retaliation. The decisive moment came when Theodoric personally led a cavalry charge against Odoacer's left wing, where communication problems between Roman and Germanic units had created gaps in the defensive line. The Gothic king's presence at the critical point of attack provided both tactical leadership and psychological inspiration for his warriors, who pressed their advantage with the ferocity that had characterized Germanic warfare for centuries. Contemporary accounts describe Theodoric fighting in the front ranks with his traditional longsword, his distinctive armour marking him as a target for enemy missiles, while inspiring his followers to extraordinary efforts. Odoacer's army, despite fierce resistance, could not maintain cohesion under the sustained Gothic pressure. The breakthrough on the left wing allowed Theodoric's cavalry to roll up the entire defensive line, forcing a general retreat that quickly became a rout. The fleeing troops abandoned their equipment and supplies in their haste to escape, providing the Goths with substantial quantities of weapons, armour, and provisions that would prove valuable in subsequent operations. Archaeological excavations in the vicinity of Verona have uncovered weapon caches and coin hoards that likely date to this battle, confirming the scale of Odoacer's defeat. The aftermath of Verona demonstrated Theodoric's growing political sophistication as he balanced military success with the diplomatic requirements of governing a complex society. Rather than pursuing the defeated army immediately, he devoted several weeks to consolidating control over northern Italy and establishing administrative arrangements that would ensure continued local cooperation. Gothic administrators, many of whom had learned Roman bureaucratic methods during their imperial service, worked to maintain existing tax collection systems while adapting them to support the new regime's military and political requirements. The treatment of captured Roman senators and other high-ranking officials revealed Theodoric's strategy for managing the Italian aristocracy, whose support would be essential for long-term stability. Rather than executing or imprisoning these potential rivals, the Gothic king offered them positions within his emerging administration, recognizing their expertise in legal, financial, and diplomatic matters that Gothic nobles lacked. This policy of selective integration allowed Theodoric to benefit from Roman administrative experience, while demonstrating that Gothic rule would respect traditional social hierarchies and legal procedures. The Catholic Church's response to Gothic conquest presented particular challenges, as Theodoric's Arian Christianity differed fundamentally from the Nicene orthodoxy that dominated Italian religious life. However, the Gothic king's policy of religious toleration, learned through observation of imperial practices during his years in Constantinople, prevented theological differences from becoming sources of active resistance. Catholic bishops who accepted Gothic political authority were permitted to maintain their positions and continue their pastoral duties, while church properties remained under ecclesiastical control rather than being confiscated for military purposes. The siege of Ravenna, beginning in early 490 AD, represented the culmination of Theodoric's Italian campaign and the ultimate test of his military capabilities. Odoacer had withdrawn to this heavily fortified capital after his defeat at Verona, recognizing that the city's position in the midst of extensive marshlands made it virtually impregnable to conventional assault. The defensive advantages of Ravenna included not only its difficult terrain, but also its access to the sea, which allowed continued communication with potential allies and the importation of supplies necessary for extended resistance. The Gothic approach to besieging Ravenna demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Theodoric had developed through decades of military experience. Rather than attempting direct assault against the city's formidable fortifications, Gothic engineers began systematic construction of siege works designed to isolate the defenders while providing protected positions for their own forces. These fortifications, built according to Roman engineering principles learned during Theodoric's imperial service, included timber palisades, earthwork ramparts, and strategically positioned towers that commanded approaches to the city. The integration of Gothic cavalry tactics with Roman siege techniques created a blockade system that gradually tightened around Ravenna over the course of nearly 3 years. Gothic horsemen, operating from fortified camps positioned throughout the surrounding marshlands, intercepted supply convoys and prevented communication between the besieged city and potential relief forces. Meanwhile, Gothic engineers constructed causeway approaches across the wetlands, using fascines and stone fill to create solid foundations for siege equipment that could threaten the city's walls directly. The prolonged nature of the siege tested both armies' endurance and logistical capabilities. Theodoric's forces, supplied by the agricultural resources of northern Italy and supported by tribute from Italian cities that had submitted to Gothic authority, maintained their effectiveness throughout the extended campaign. Odoacer's garrison, by contrast, faced increasing shortages of food and military supplies as the Gothic blockade proved increasingly effective. Contemporary sources describe growing desperation within Ravenna as civilian populations suffered from malnutrition, while military effectiveness declined due to inadequate equipment maintenance and declining morale. The final phase of the siege revealed the complex political calculations that influenced military decision-making in late 5th century Italy. By 493 AD, both Theodoric and Odoacer recognized that continued warfare served neither side's long-term interests, as prolonged conflict weakened Italian defences against potential threats from other barbarian groups or imperial intervention from Constantinople. Secret negotiations, conducted through intermediaries who could move between the opposing camps, explored possibilities for political settlement that would end the siege while preserving the honour and safety of both leaders. The agreement reached in February 493 AD appeared to offer a reasonable compromise that would allow both kings to share power in Italy while ending the destructive warfare that had devastated much of the peninsula. Odoacer would retain his royal title and continue governing certain territories, while Theodoric would assume overall leadership of the combined Gothic and Syrian military forces. This arrangement reflected the complex realities of post-imperial politics, where practical power sharing often proved more effective than attempts to achieve complete military victory. The banquet held at Ravenna on March 15th, 493 AD, ostensibly to celebrate the new political arrangement, became instead the scene of Odoacer's assassination. Theodoric, either acting on predetermined plans or responding to immediate circumstances that threatened the stability of the agreement, killed his rival with his own sword during the feast. Contemporary accounts provide conflicting details about the specific events that led to this violence, but the outcome was clear. Theodoric had eliminated his primary rival for control of Italy, while demonstrating to potential opponents that he possessed both the will and capability to use decisive force when necessary. The murder of Odoacer, followed immediately by the systematic elimination of his principal supporters, established Theodoric as the undisputed ruler of Italy. The Gothic king's assumption of the title Rex Italiae marked the formal beginning of Ostrogothic royal authority over the Italian peninsula, though the practical challenges of governing this complex territory would require decades of careful political and administrative development. The conquest that had begun with the crossing of the Isonzo River had culminated in the establishment of the most successful barbarian kingdom in post-imperial Europe. The administrative apparatus that Theodoric constructed following his consolidation of power in Italy represented one of the most sophisticated attempts at cultural synthesis in early medieval Europe. The Gothic king faced the unprecedented challenge of governing a population that was perhaps 90% Roman, while maintaining the loyalty of his Gothic warriors who expected traditional Germanic leadership structures. His solution involved creating parallel administrative systems that allowed both populations to operate according to their customary legal and cultural frameworks while ensuring unified political control under Amal royal authority. The Palatium at Ravenna became the nerve centre of this complex governmental system, housing both Gothic royal household officials and Roman bureaucratic departments that had survived from the imperial period. Theodoric retained the services of experienced Roman administrators like Cassiodorus, whose family had served imperial governments for generations, while appointing Gothic nobles to military commands and territorial governorships that required direct control over warrior populations. This dual structure allowed the king to benefit from Roman expertise in taxation, law, and diplomacy, while maintaining the personal loyalty bonds that formed the foundation of Germanic political authority. The legal framework governing Ostrogothic Italy reflected this same principle of parallel systems operating under unified royal oversight. Romans continued to live under Roman law, administered by Roman judges using traditional legal procedures and precedents established during centuries of imperial development. Gothic populations, meanwhile, followed customary Germanic law codes that emphasized personal honor, kinship obligations, and compensation payments for various offences. The King's Court served as the ultimate appellate authority for both systems, with Theodoric personally hearing cases that involved disputes between Goths and Romans or matters that affected royal prerogatives. The military organisation that supported this administrative structure combined Gothic warrior traditions with Roman tactical methods and logistical systems. The regular army consisted primarily of Gothic heavy cavalry and infantry units, organised around traditional comitatus relationships between nobles and their armed retainers. These forces maintained their ancestral weapons and fighting techniques, while incorporating Roman siege equipment, engineering capabilities, and standardised supply systems that enabled sustained military operations across the Italian peninsula. Roman military units that had served under Odoacer were largely disbanded, though individual soldiers who demonstrated loyalty to the new regime could earn positions within Gothic formations. Provincial administration throughout Italy relied heavily on Roman institutional frameworks that had proven effective during centuries of imperial rule. The existing system of provincial governors, municipal magistrates, and local administrative councils continued to function under Gothic oversight, collecting taxes, maintaining public works, and adjudicating legal disputes according to established procedures. Gothic counts appointed by Theodoric supervised these Roman officials, ensuring that local administration served royal interests while respecting traditional privileges and customs that maintained social stability. The economic policies implemented during Theodoric's reign demonstrated his understanding that Italian prosperity depended on maintaining commercial networks that had sustained Mediterranean trade for centuries. The Gothic king actively promoted merchant activities by ensuring the security of trade routes, standardising weights and measures, and negotiating commercial agreements with other kingdoms and the Eastern Roman Empire. Italian agricultural production, which had declined during the warfare of the late 5th century, recovered significantly under Gothic protection as landowners gained confidence in the stability of the new regime. The restoration of Italy's physical infrastructure became one of Theodoric's most visible achievements and a powerful symbol of Gothic commitment to Italian welfare. The ancient Roman road system, which had deteriorated during decades of political instability and insufficient maintenance, received systematic attention from Gothic engineers who combined traditional Roman construction techniques with innovations learned during their military campaigns. The Via Flaminia, connecting Rome with Ravenna, underwent extensive reconstruction that included new bridges, improved drainage systems, and reinforced roadbeds capable of supporting heavy military traffic. Aqueduct restoration projects throughout the Italian peninsula demonstrated the Gothic regime's commitment to urban welfare and its ability to mobilise the technical expertise necessary for complex engineering undertakings. The ancient aqueducts serving Rome, Milan and other major cities had suffered from neglect and deliberate damage during the political upheavals of the previous century. Gothic engineers working alongside Roman technical specialists rebuilt damaged sections using traditional construction methods while implementing improvements that increased water flow capacity and system reliability. The harbour facilities at Ravenna received particular attention as Theodoric recognised their strategic importance for both military operations and commercial activities. The port installations, which had served as the primary naval base for the Western Roman Empire, required extensive dredging and reconstruction to accommodate the increasing volume of trade that flowed through Gothic territories. New warehouses, constructed using timber from the Alpine regions combined with stone quarried from traditional Roman sources, provided secure storage for goods awaiting shipment to destinations throughout the Mediterranean basin. Theodoric's religious policies reflected his sophisticated understanding of the theological complexities that divided Italian society and threatened political stability. As an Arian Christian ruling over a predominantly Catholic population, the Gothic king faced constant pressure to either convert to Nicene orthodoxy or impose Arian beliefs on his Roman subjects. His solution involved maintaining strict religious neutrality in governmental affairs while protecting the rights of both Christian communities to practice their respective theological traditions without interference. The relationship between the Ostrogothic court and the Catholic Church developed along lines that balanced royal authority with ecclesiastical independence. Catholic bishops retained control over their dioceses and church properties while acknowledging Theodoric's political supremacy and accepting his role in resolving disputes that affected public order. The king appointed Catholic clergy to positions within his administration where their education and diplomatic skills proved valuable, while ensuring that Arian priests maintained their traditional roles within Gothic military and court circles. The papacy's position under Gothic rule presented particular challenges, as the Bishop of Rome claimed spiritual authority that transcended political boundaries while residing within territories under Theodoric's direct control. The Gothic king generally supported papal prerogatives in religious matters, while insisting on royal approval for papal elections and major policy decisions that might affect relations with other kingdoms or the Eastern Roman Empire. This arrangement allowed both parties to maintain their essential claims while avoiding direct confrontations that could destabilise Italian politics. The construction of new churches throughout Italy during Theodoric's reign demonstrated the Gothic commitment to religious tolerance, while showcasing the architectural capabilities of the combined Gothic-Roman administrative system. Arian churches built for Gothic congregations incorporated traditional Germanic decorative elements with Roman construction techniques, creating distinctive architectural styles that reflected the cultural synthesis occurring throughout Ostrogothic society. Catholic churches continued to receive royal patronage for construction and renovation projects, ensuring that both religious communities could maintain adequate facilities for their worship and community activities. The diplomatic networks that Theodoric established with other barbarian kingdoms created a web of alliances that secured Italian borders while enhancing Gothic prestige throughout post-imperial Europe. Marriage alliances formed the cornerstone of this diplomatic strategy, as royal weddings created kinship bonds that transcended ethnic boundaries and provided mechanisms for resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than warfare. Theodoric's own marriage to Audafleda, sister of the Frankish king Clovis, exemplified this approach by linking the Ostrogothic and Frankish royal houses despite their different religious affiliations. The marriage of Theodoric's daughter Ostrogotho to Sigismund, heir to the Burgundian throne, created another crucial alliance that secured the Alpine passes connecting Italy with Gaul. This union brought together two Arian royal families whose cooperation could counter the growing influence of Catholic Frankish power in southeastern Gaul. The wedding ceremony, held at Ravenna with elaborate Gothic and Burgundian ceremonial elements, demonstrated the cultural sophistication that characterized diplomatic relations between barbarian kingdoms in the early 6th century. The alliance with the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, sealed through the marriage of Theodoric's sister Amalafrida to King Thrasimund, created a powerful anti-Byzantine coalition that controlled much of the western Mediterranean. This diplomatic arrangement provided mutual security guarantees while facilitating commercial exchanges between Italian and African territories. The Vandal alliance also offered potential military cooperation against Eastern Roman attempts to reconquer former imperial territories in the west. Relations with the Visigothic kingdom in Spain developed through both marriage alliances and territorial agreements that defined spheres of influence in southern Gaul. Theodoric's daughter Theodogotho married the Visigothic king Alaric II, creating kinship bonds that facilitated cooperation in military and diplomatic matters. When Frankish expansion threatened Visigothic territories, Theodoric provided military assistance that demonstrated the practical value of these alliance systems, while establishing Gothic influence in regions beyond the Italian peninsula. The economic prosperity that characterized Theodoric's reign reflected both the security provided by effective government and the revival of commercial networks that had been disrupted during the political upheavals of the late 5th century. Italian agricultural production increased significantly as landowners invested in improvements to their estates, confident that Gothic protection would allow them to retain the benefits of their investments. The cultivation of new lands, particularly in the Po Valley, where Gothic settlers had established agricultural communities, expanded the kingdom's food production capacity while providing economic opportunities for both Gothic and Roman populations. Manufacturing activities throughout Italy experienced substantial growth as craftsmen gained access to raw materials through revived trade networks, while benefiting from stable political conditions that encouraged long-term business planning. Textile production, centred in cities like Milan and Florence, supplied both domestic markets and export trade with other Mediterranean regions. Metalworking shops in Rome and other urban centres produced weapons, tools and decorative objects that combined traditional Roman techniques with Gothic artistic preferences, creating distinctive products that found markets throughout barbarian Europe. The monetary system established under Gothic rule maintained Roman standards and denominations, while featuring royal imagery that proclaimed Theodoric's authority throughout Italian territories. Gold solidi bearing the king's portrait and titles circulated alongside Byzantine coins, creating a stable currency system that facilitated both local commerce and international trade. The continued operation of mints in Rome, Milan and Ravenna ensured adequate supplies of coinage, while providing visible symbols of Gothic sovereignty that reinforced royal authority in daily economic transactions. Commercial relations with the Eastern Roman Empire developed despite underlying political tensions between Theodoric and successive Byzantine emperors. Italian merchants maintained access to Constantinople's markets, while Byzantine goods continued to flow into Italian territories, creating mutual economic benefits that both sides recognized as valuable regardless of their political differences. The Gothic court's diplomatic correspondence with Constantinople, preserved in the letters of Cassiodorus, reveals the complex negotiations required to maintain these commercial relationships, while managing competing territorial claims and religious disputes. The cultural achievements of Theodoric's reign reflected the successful integration of Gothic and Roman intellectual traditions under royal patronage that encouraged learning and artistic production. The court at Ravenna became a centre of scholarship where Gothic nobles and Roman intellectuals collaborated on literary projects that preserved classical knowledge while adapting it to contemporary political and social needs. The translation of Latin texts into Gothic script undertaken by scholars like Jordanes ensured that traditional Germanic culture could coexist with Roman literary heritage. Architectural projects throughout Italy during this period demonstrated the synthesis of Gothic and Roman building traditions that characterized Ostrogothic material culture. The palace complex at Ravenna, expanded and renovated under Theodoric's direction, incorporated traditional Roman architectural elements with Germanic decorative motifs that proclaimed royal identity while respecting Italian aesthetic preferences. Churches, public buildings and private residences constructed during this period displayed similar combinations of cultural influences that reflected the broader social integration occurring throughout the kingdom. The educational system that developed under Gothic rule preserved Roman pedagogical traditions while adapting them to serve the needs of a culturally diverse society. Schools in major cities continued to teach classical rhetoric, grammar, and literature using traditional Roman curricula, while Gothic nobles increasingly sent their children to these institutions to acquire the skills necessary for administrative and diplomatic careers. This educational integration created a generation of Gothic and Roman elites who shared common intellectual foundations despite their different ethnic backgrounds. The intellectual renaissance that flourished under Theodoric's patronage represented one of the most remarkable achievements of early medieval Europe, as Gothic royal resources supported the preservation and transmission of classical learning through a generation of scholars whose work would influence European culture for centuries. The court at Ravenna became a magnet for educated Romans who recognized that the barbarian king offered better protection for traditional scholarship than the increasingly unstable political conditions in other regions of the former Western Empire. These intellectuals found in Theodoric a ruler who understood the practical value of Roman administrative expertise while genuinely appreciating the cultural heritage that classical education represented. Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius emerged as perhaps the most significant figure in this intellectual flowering, his career embodying the successful synthesis of Roman philosophical traditions with the practical demands of Gothic governance. Born around 480 AD into one of Rome's most distinguished senatorial families, Boethius received the finest classical education available, studying rhetoric, mathematics, and philosophy in the traditional Roman manner while also acquiring fluency in Greek that allowed him direct access to Aristotelian and Platonic texts. His appointment to high administrative positions under Theodoric reflected both his intellectual capabilities and his family's political connections, but more importantly demonstrated the Gothic king's commitment to employing the best available talent, regardless of ethnic background. The scholarly projects that Boethius undertook during his years of royal service aimed at preserving and transmitting the entire corpus of classical learning to future generations. His translations of Aristotelian logical works into Latin provided medieval scholars with their primary access to Greek philosophical methods, while his commentaries on these texts explained complex concepts in language accessible to readers without extensive philosophical training. The mathematical treatises he composed covering arithmetic, geometry, and music theory became standard textbooks in European schools for over 500 years, their clear explanations and systematic organization making abstract concepts comprehensible to students throughout the medieval period. The administrative responsibilities that occupied much of Boethius's time involved managing the complex financial systems that supported Theodoric's government, while maintaining the delicate balance between Gothic military needs and Roman civilian expectations. His position as Magister Officiorum required oversight of the entire palace bureaucracy, coordinating the activities of dozens of departments that handled everything from tax collection to diplomatic correspondence. The efficiency with which these systems operated under his supervision demonstrated that Roman administrative methods remained highly effective when properly implemented, even under barbarian political authority. The theological works that Boethius produced during this period reflected his attempt to reconcile classical philosophical reasoning with Christian doctrine, creating intellectual frameworks that would influence medieval theology for centuries. His treatises on the Trinity employed Aristotelian logical methods to analyse complex theological questions, while his discussions of divine providence and human free will addressed fundamental problems that concerned both classical philosophers and Christian thinkers. These works demonstrated that Gothic patronage could support the highest levels of intellectual inquiry, as royal resources enabled scholars to pursue complex theoretical investigations without concern for immediate practical applications. Magnus Aurelius, Cassiodorus' senator, represented another dimension of the intellectual synthesis occurring under Gothic rule, his career spanning both administrative service and scholarly achievement in ways that demonstrated the compatibility of practical governance with serious learning. Born around 485 AD into a family that had served Roman governments for generations, Cassiodorus inherited both the administrative skills and cultural knowledge that made him invaluable to Theodoric's regime. His appointment as quaestor, responsible for drafting official documents and royal correspondence, placed him at the centre of Gothic diplomatic and administrative activities, while providing opportunities to observe the workings of barbarian kingship from the highest levels. The official letters that Cassiodorus composed on Theodoric's behalf, later collected in his Variae, provide unparalleled insights into the daily operations of the Ostrogothic kingdom, while demonstrating the sophisticated rhetorical skills that Roman education continued to produce. These documents, addressing everything from judicial appointments to public works projects, reveal the king's attention to administrative detail while showcasing the classical learning that informed Gothic governmental practices. The elaborate Latin prose in which these letters were composed served both practical and symbolic functions, conducting official business while proclaiming the cultural sophistication of the Gothic court to audiences throughout the Mediterranean world. The historical works that Cassiodorus produced, including his chronicle and his lost Gothic history, attempted to integrate Germanic tribal traditions with Roman historical writing methods, creating narratives that legitimize Gothic rule while preserving traditional Roman literary forms. His chronicle provided a comprehensive overview of world history, from creation to his own time, placing Gothic achievements within the broader context of divine providence and historical development. The Gothic history, known primarily through its influence on Jordanes' later Getica, presented the Ostrogoths as worthy successors to Roman imperial authority, emphasizing their military virtues and cultural achievements, while minimizing the violent aspects of their conquest of Italy. The educational institutions that Cassiodorus established at his monastery of Vivarium represented his most lasting contribution to European intellectual development, creating systematic programs for preserving and transmitting classical learning through the turbulent centuries that followed the collapse of Roman political authority. The library he assembled contained both pagan classical texts and Christian theological works, recognizing that complete education required familiarity with the entire heritage of Mediterranean civilization. The copying workshops he organized employed dozens of scribes who produced manuscripts that preserved essential texts through the political upheavals of the early medieval period. Quintus Aurelius Memmius Symmachus embodied the continuation of traditional Roman senatorial culture under Gothic rule, his career demonstrating that aristocratic families could maintain their social positions and cultural values while accepting barbarian political authority. Born into one of Rome's most prestigious families around 460 AD, Symmachus inherited not only vast landed wealth, but also the cultural expectations that accompanied senatorial status, including patronage of learning, support for traditional religious practices, and maintenance of the elaborate social rituals that defined aristocratic identity. His relationship with Theodoric reflected the mutual benefits that could result from cooperation between Gothic royal authority and Roman aristocratic resources. The literary patronage that Symmachus provided supported both established scholars and promising younger intellectuals who might otherwise have lacked resources to pursue their studies. His private library, one of the largest in contemporary Italy, contained rare manuscripts that attracted scholars from across Europe while providing research materials for projects that advanced understanding of classical literature and philosophy. The scholarly gatherings held at his Roman mansion created informal academies where intellectual discussions flourished under conditions of luxury and security that encouraged serious inquiry into complex theoretical questions. The political activities that occupied Symmachus during the later years of Theodoric's reign involved him in the religious controversies that increasingly complicated relations between the Gothic kingdom and the Eastern Roman Empire. His appointment as papal envoy to Constantinople in 525 AD reflected both his diplomatic skills and his family's traditional connections with imperial court circles, but the mission's failure contributed to the deteriorating relationship between Theodoric and his Roman subjects that would characterize the final years of Gothic rule. The accusations of treason that led to his execution alongside Boethius demonstrated the fragility of the cultural synthesis that had flourished during the kingdom's golden age. The architectural achievements that marked Theodoric's reign represented the most visible expressions of the cultural fusion occurring throughout Ostrogothic society, as royal building projects combined Germanic, symbolic requirements with Roman engineering capabilities and Italian aesthetic preferences. The mausoleum of Theodoric in Ravenna, begun around 520 AD, embodied this synthesis in its unique design that incorporated elements from multiple architectural traditions while creating something entirely new. The massive stone structure, built from Istrian limestone quarried across the Adriatic and transported to Ravenna by sea, demonstrated both the kingdom's economic resources and its ability to organize complex logistical operations. The construction techniques employed in the mausoleum revealed the sophisticated engineering capabilities that Gothic builders had developed through collaboration with Roman craftsmen and architects. The building's most remarkable feature, a monolithic dome weighing over 300 tons, required innovative lifting methods that combined traditional Roman engineering with Germanic metalworking skills to create the specialized equipment necessary for positioning such massive stone elements. The precision with which the dome was cut and fitted demonstrated mastery of stone carving techniques that rivaled the best work of the imperial period. The decorative elements incorporated into the mausoleum's design reflected the cultural preferences of both Gothic and Roman traditions, while creating distinctive artistic expressions that belonged fully to neither. The exterior walls featured carved friezes depicting traditional Germanic animal motifs, executed with the technical precision characteristic of Roman sculptural workshops, while the interior spaces incorporated mosaic decorations that combined Christian symbolic elements with secular themes drawn from classical mythology. These decorative programs required close collaboration between artists from different cultural backgrounds, each contributing specialized skills to create unified artistic statements. The symbolic significance of the mausoleum extended far beyond its function as a royal tomb, serving as a permanent monument to Gothic legitimacy and cultural achievement that would outlast the kingdom itself. The building's prominent position within Ravenna's urban landscape proclaimed royal authority to daily viewers, while its architectural sophistication demonstrated that barbarian rulers could patronize projects rivaling the greatest achievements of imperial Rome. The inscription recording Theodoric's titles and achievements, carved in both Latin and runic scripts, proclaimed the cultural synthesis that characterized his reign while asserting Gothic claims to equal status with Roman imperial traditions. The restoration projects that Theodoric sponsored throughout Italy demonstrated his commitment to preserving the physical infrastructure that supported Italian prosperity while showcasing Gothic capabilities in managing complex engineering undertakings. The renovation of the Circus Maximus in Rome, undertaken around 500 AD, required massive investments of both financial resources and technical expertise to repair centuries of accumulated damage, while adapting the ancient structure to contemporary entertainment preferences. The project employed hundreds of craftsmen working under Gothic supervision, their collaboration producing results that satisfied both traditional Roman expectations and barbarian royal requirements for impressive public spectacles. The restoration of ancient Roman monuments throughout the Italian peninsula served both practical and symbolic functions, maintaining essential infrastructure while demonstrating Gothic respect for Italian cultural heritage. The repair of bridges along major roadways ensured continued commercial and military communications, while the renovation of public buildings in Rome, Milan and other major cities provided visible evidence of royal concern for urban welfare. These projects required careful coordination between Gothic administrators and Roman technical specialists, their successful completion demonstrating the effectiveness of the collaborative governmental systems that Theodoric had established. The development of distinctive Ostrogothic material culture during this period reflected the gradual emergence of artistic traditions that incorporated elements from Germanic, Roman, and Byzantine sources, while creating expressions that belonged fully to none of these individual traditions. Gothic metalworkers adapted traditional cloisonne techniques to produce jewellery and decorative objects that featured Roman mythological subjects rendered in Germanic artistic styles, while Roman craftsmen incorporated barbarian decorative motifs into traditional Mediterranean art forms. This cultural cross-fertilization produced artistic expressions that reflected the complex ethnic composition of Ostrogothic society. The polychrome jewellery tradition that flourished under Gothic patronage represented perhaps the most successful fusion of different artistic traditions, combining Germanic metalworking techniques with gemstones and decorative materials imported from across the Mediterranean world. Gothic workshops in Ravenna and other Italian cities produced elaborate fibulae, belt fittings, and personal ornaments that incorporated garnets from India, pearls from the Red Sea, and gold worked according to techniques learned from Byzantine craftsmen. These objects served both functional and symbolic purposes, displaying their owner's wealth and status while proclaiming their participation in the cosmopolitan culture of the Ostrogothic court. The manuscript illumination that developed in scriptoriums associated with Gothic patronage demonstrated similar patterns of cultural synthesis, as traditional Roman book production methods incorporated decorative elements drawn from Germanic artistic traditions. The illuminated manuscripts produced for members of the Gothic court featured elaborate initial letters decorated with interlaced animal motifs, characteristic of barbarian art, while maintaining the classical proportions and spatial organisation that defined Roman book design. These manuscripts served both practical functions as texts for study and ceremonial purposes as symbols of royal cultural sophistication. The legal codification efforts undertaken during Theodoric's reign reflected his sophisticated understanding of the administrative challenges involved in governing an ethnically diverse population while maintaining social stability and political legitimacy. The principle of personality of law, which allowed different ethnic groups to live according to their traditional legal customs, required complex administrative arrangements that could accommodate multiple legal systems operating simultaneously within the same territorial boundaries. Gothic administrators developed sophisticated procedures for determining which legal tradition applied to specific cases while ensuring that royal authority remained supreme over all local jurisdictions. The Edictum Theodorici, promulgated around 500 AD, represented the most systematic attempt to codify the legal principles governing Ostrogothic Italy, while respecting the diverse legal traditions that existed within the kingdom's population. This legal code addressed primarily criminal matters and administrative procedures that affected public order, establishing uniform standards for offences like theft, assault and treason, while allowing civil disputes to be resolved according to the customary laws of the parties involved. The code's provisions demonstrated careful balance between Germanic legal concepts, emphasizing personal honor and compensation with Roman legal principles focusing on state authority and systematic jurisprudence. The administrative procedures developed for implementing this dual legal system required extensive training for judges and court officials who needed to understand the principles governing both Gothic and Roman legal traditions. Legal schools established in major Italian cities provided instruction in comparative jurisprudence, teaching aspiring administrators to navigate the complex relationships between different legal systems while ensuring consistent application of royal authority. These educational programs produced a generation of legal professionals capable of managing the sophisticated judicial arrangements that made Ostrogothic governance possible. The practical operation of separate legal systems within unified political structures created opportunities for legal innovation, as jurists developed new procedures for resolving conflicts between different legal traditions. Cases involving disputes between Goths and Romans required careful analysis to determine appropriate jurisdictional procedures, while mixed marriages and commercial partnerships created legal relationships that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries. The solutions developed for these complex situations contributed to the evolution of legal concepts that would influence European jurisprudence for centuries. The death of Theodoric the Great on August 30th, 526 AD, at his palace in Ravenna, marked the end of an era that had witnessed the most successful barbarian kingdom in post-imperial Europe reach unprecedented heights of political stability and cultural achievement. The great king's final months had been shadowed by the executions of Boethius and Symmachus, decisions that revealed the underlying tensions between Gothic royal authority and Roman aristocratic expectations that his earlier policies had successfully managed to contain. As Theodoric's body lay in state within the magnificent mausoleum he had constructed as his eternal monument, the Ostrogothic nobility faced the daunting challenge of maintaining the delicate balance between Germanic warrior traditions and Roman administrative sophistication that had sustained their kingdom's prosperity for over 3 decades. The succession arrangements that Theodoric had established before his death reflected his acute awareness of the potential instabilities that could threaten Ostrogothic unity following the loss of his personal authority. His grandson Athalaric, son of his deceased daughter Amalasuntha, and her husband Eutharic, represented the legitimate continuation of the Amal royal bloodline, but the boy's tender age of barely 10 years necessitated a regency that would test the kingdom's institutional structures in ways that Theodoric's direct rule had never required. The appointment of Amalasuntha as regent demonstrated the dead king's confidence in his daughter's political acumen and her understanding of the complex diplomatic relationships that sustained Ostrogothic independence. But it also placed unprecedented authority in the hands of a woman whose exercise of power would challenge traditional Germanic concepts of royal leadership. Amalasuntha's education and preparation for political responsibility had been exceptional even by the standards of the sophisticated Ostrogothic court. Born around 495 AD during the height of her father's power, she had received instruction in both Gothic warrior traditions and Roman administrative methods, acquiring fluency in Latin, Greek and Gothic that enabled her to communicate effectively with all segments of the kingdom's diverse population. Her marriage to Eutharic, a Gothic noble of royal Amal lineage, who had been recalled from Spain specifically to strengthen dynastic succession, had been carefully arranged to combine political necessity with personal compatibility, producing not only the required heir, but also a partnership that demonstrated successful integration of Gothic and Roman cultural elements. The regency government that Amalasuntha established following her father's death attempted to maintain the administrative systems and diplomatic relationships that had sustained Ostrogothic prosperity while adapting to the changed circumstances created by the succession of a minor. The royal council that advised the regent included both Gothic military commanders who had served Theodoric faithfully for decades and Roman administrators whose expertise in legal and financial matters remained essential for effective governance. This collaborative approach initially proved successful in maintaining internal stability and external security, as potential rivals recognized that any attempt to challenge the regency would face unified opposition from the kingdom's established political elite. The young King Athalaric's education became a focal point for debates about the future direction of Ostrogothic society, as different factions within the nobility advocated competing visions of royal preparation that reflected deeper disagreements about cultural identity and political strategy. Amalasuntha favoured a comprehensive educational programme that would equip her son with both the classical learning necessary for diplomatic relations with the Eastern Roman Empire and the military skills required for leadership of Gothic warrior bands. This approach emphasised the cultural synthesis that had characterised Theodoric's reign, viewing intellectual sophistication and martial prowess as complementary rather than competing elements of royal authority. The Gothic military aristocracy, however, increasingly expressed concerns that excessive emphasis on Roman educational methods would undermine the young king's credibility, with warrior followers who valued traditional Germanic concepts of leadership based on personal courage and martial achievement. These nobles, many of whom had distinguished themselves in the Italian conquest and subsequent military campaigns, argued that royal education should prioritise horsemanship, weapons training, and the development of personal relationships with Gothic military commanders over the study of classical literature and Roman administrative procedures. Their concerns reflected broader anxieties about the gradual erosion of a distinctive Gothic cultural identity under the influence of Roman intellectual traditions. The emergence of distinct pro-Roman and pro-Gothic factions within the Ostrogothic court represented the crystallization of tensions that had remained largely dormant during Theodoric's lifetime, but now threatened to fragment the political consensus that had sustained the kingdom's stability. The pro-Roman faction, led by nobles who had benefited from the cultural synthesis policies of the previous reign, advocated continued cooperation with Constantinople and maintenance of the sophisticated administrative systems that had enabled effective governance of the Italian peninsula. These leaders recognised that Ostrogothic military strength alone could not sustain long-term control over a predominantly Roman population without the legitimacy that came from respecting established legal and cultural traditions. The pro-Gothic faction, by contrast, emphasised the need to preserve distinctive Germanic cultural practices and political structures that differentiated the Ostrogoths from their Roman subjects while maintaining the warrior ethos that had enabled their ancestors' military successes. These nobles argued that excessive accommodation to Roman preferences had weakened Gothic military effectiveness and undermined the personal loyalty bonds between kings and warriors that formed the foundation of Germanic political authority. Their concerns were not merely cultural, but reflected practical anxieties about the kingdom's ability to defend itself against external threats if Gothic military traditions continued to be diluted by Roman influences. The diplomatic challenges that confronted the Regency government intensified these internal divisions, while creating opportunities for external enemies to exploit Ostrogothic political uncertainties. The Eastern Roman Empire under Emperor Justinian had begun implementing increasingly aggressive policies aimed at recovering former imperial territories in the west, viewing the succession of a minor as an opportune moment to challenge Ostrogothic control over Italy. Byzantine diplomatic missions to Ravenna combined expressions of friendship with subtle threats and offers of support for alternative claimants to Gothic royal authority, creating pressures that tested the Regency's ability to maintain unified responses to external challenges. The religious policies that had maintained stability during Theodoric's reign became sources of increasing controversy as different factions advocated competing approaches to managing relationships between the Arian Gothic minority and the Catholic Roman majority. Amalasuntha's continuation of her father's tolerant policies satisfied neither extreme, as pro-Gothic nobles demanded more aggressive promotion of Arian Christianity, while pro-Roman factions suggested that conversion to Catholicism might improve relations with both the Italian population and the Eastern Roman Empire. These religious debates reflected deeper questions about cultural identity and political strategy that threatened to undermine the careful balance that had sustained Ostrogothic rule. The papacy's relationship with the regency government became particularly complex as successive popes tested the boundaries of ecclesiastical independence. While the Gothic court struggled to maintain traditional policies without Theodoric's personal authority to enforce compliance, Pope John II, elected in 533 AD, proved more assertive in defending Catholic interests than his predecessors, challenging Gothic appointments to episcopal positions while maintaining correspondence with Constantinople that suggested potential disloyalty to Ostrogothic political authority. These ecclesiastical disputes created additional sources of tension within Italian society, while providing Byzantine agents with opportunities to cultivate support for imperial intervention. The military challenges that emerged during the Regency period reveal the extent to which Ostrogothic defensive capabilities had become dependent on Theodoric's personal leadership and the diplomatic relationships he had cultivated with neighbouring kingdoms. Frankish expansion in southern Gaul threatened the territorial arrangements that had secured the Alpine passes, while Byzantine naval activities in the Adriatic suggested preparation for more aggressive intervention in Italian affairs. The Gothic military response to these challenges lacked the coordination and strategic vision that had characterized operations under Theodoric's direct command, as competing factions within the court advocated different priorities for defensive preparations. The growing influence of Gothic military commanders, who had not benefited from the cultural synthesis of the previous reign, created additional sources of internal tension, as these leaders challenged the authority of nobles who had served in administrative positions under Theodoric. The warrior aristocracy's traditional expectations of royal generosity through distribution of plunder and territorial grants conflicted with the financial constraints imposed by the need to maintain expensive administrative systems and diplomatic relationships. These economic pressures forced the regency government to make difficult choices between satisfying Gothic military demands and preserving the Roman cooperation that enabled effective governance of Italian territories. Amalasuntha's personal authority faced increasing challenges from Gothic nobles who questioned both her gender and her commitment to traditional Germanic political values, criticism that reflected broader anxieties about the direction of Ostrogothic cultural development. The regent's obvious intellectual sophistication and her comfortable relationships with Roman administrators provided ammunition for opponents who argued that she had become too removed from Gothic warrior traditions to provide effective leadership during periods of external threat. These personal attacks on the regent's legitimacy created political instabilities that encouraged ambitious nobles to consider alternative arrangements for royal succession. The conspiracy that culminated in Amalasuntha's murder on April 30th, 535 AD, represented the violent resolution of tensions that had been building throughout the Regency period between competing visions of Ostrogothic political and cultural identity. The plot involved Gothic nobles led by Theodahad, a member of the royal Amal family, whose claims to the throne were strengthened by his gender and his reputation for maintaining traditional Germanic values. The conspirators justified their actions by arguing that Amalasuntha's policies had weakened Gothic military effectiveness, while compromising the kingdom's independence through excessive accommodation to Roman and Byzantine interests. The assassination took place on the island of Martana in Lake Bolsena, where Amalasuntha had been imprisoned following Theodahad's coup that had initially appeared to establish a joint monarchy, preserving the regent's life while transferring effective power to male royal authority. The isolated location chosen for the murder reflected the conspirators' awareness that their actions would provoke strong reactions from both domestic supporters of the murdered queen and external powers that had maintained diplomatic relationships with the regency government. The method of execution, reportedly strangulation in a bathhouse, combined practical efficiency with symbolic elements that emphasized the personal nature of the political conflict that had motivated the crime. The immediate consequences of Amalasuntha's murder extended far beyond the internal political changes within the Ostrogothic kingdom, as news of the assassination provided Emperor Justinian with the justification he'd been seeking for direct military intervention in Italian affairs. The Byzantine emperor had maintained correspondence with the murdered queen that could be interpreted as guaranteeing her personal safety, while her death removed a potential diplomatic partner who might have negotiated peaceful solutions to the territorial disputes that complicated relations between the Gothic kingdom and the Eastern Roman Empire. The assassination thus transformed what had been primarily internal Ostrogothic political tensions into an international crisis that would ultimately threaten the kingdom's survival. Theodahad's assumption of royal authority following the successful elimination of his rival revealed the fundamental weaknesses in the political arrangements that the conspirators had established to justify their actions. The new king's reputation for philosophical learning and personal piety, which had initially attracted support from nobles who viewed him as a more traditionally Gothic alternative to Amalasuntha's cosmopolitan leadership style, proved inadequate preparation for the practical challenges of royal government during a period of external threat and internal division. His lack of military experience and his unfamiliarity with the diplomatic relationships that sustained Ostrogothic independence created vulnerabilities that external enemies were quick to exploit. The fragmentation of Gothic political unity that became apparent following Theodahad's accession reflected the deeper structural problems that Amalasuntha's murder had exposed rather than resolved. The elimination of the regency government had removed the institutional frameworks that had maintained cooperation between pro-Roman and pro-Gothic factions, leaving individual nobles to pursue their own interests without regard for broader kingdom-wide concerns. Military commanders began establishing independent relationships with their troops, while territorial governors explored opportunities for autonomous action that prioritized local security over central royal authority. The diplomatic isolation that quickly developed around Theodahad's regime demonstrated the extent to which Amalasuntha's murder had damaged Ostrogothic relationships with potential allies, while providing enemies with moral justification for aggressive action. The Frankish kingdom, which had maintained generally cooperative relations with the previous government, began exploring opportunities for territorial expansion at Gothic expense, while the Vandal alliance that had provided security in the Western Mediterranean dissolved as North African politics became increasingly unstable. These diplomatic reversals left the Ostrogothic kingdom facing multiple external threats without the alliance systems that had previously deterred foreign intervention. The internal rebellions that erupted across Italian territories following news of the royal assassination revealed the extent to which Ostrogothic control had depended on the personal loyalty relationships that Theodoric had cultivated and Amalasuntha had attempted to maintain. Roman aristocrats who had accepted Gothic political authority under the previous arrangements began exploring alternatives that might provide better protection for their interests, while urban populations in major cities questioned whether continued Gothic rule could provide the security and prosperity that had justified their previous cooperation. These domestic challenges created additional military burdens for a kingdom already facing external threats on multiple frontiers. The Byzantine invasion force that assembled at Constantinople during the winter of 534-535 AD represented the most formidable military expedition launched by the Eastern Roman Empire since the failed attempt to recapture Vandal Africa under Emperor Leo I. Justinian's decision to intervene in Italian affairs reflected both opportunistic calculation and genuine strategic necessity, as the assassination of Amalasuntha had provided the moral justification required to overcome domestic opposition to expensive Western campaigns, while Ostrogothic political fragmentation offered realistic prospects for military success. The emperor's selection of Flavius Belisarius to command this expedition demonstrated his recognition that the Italian venture would require the most capable military leadership available within the imperial hierarchy. Belisarius brought to his Italian command a combination of tactical innovation and strategic vision that had already proven decisive in the successful reconquest of Vandal North Africa. His military reforms had integrated traditional Roman infantry formations with mounted archer units recruited from Hun and other steppe peoples, creating combined arms capabilities that could adapt to diverse battlefield conditions while maintaining the disciplined coordination that characterized imperial military doctrine. The 7,500 troops under his direct command represented a carefully selected force that prioritized quality over quantity, including 3,000 veteran infantry from the African campaigns, 1,000 Hun cavalry archers whose mobility and firepower had proven devastating against Vandal forces, and 400 heavily armoured cataphracts whose shock action could break enemy formations that had been disrupted by preliminary archery attacks. The naval component of Belisarius's expedition reflected the Byzantine Empire's recognition that control of Italian coastal waters would be essential for maintaining supply lines and preventing Gothic forces from receiving external assistance. The fleet of 500 vessels that accompanied the invasion force included both military transports capable of rapid troop deployment and heavily armed dromons equipped with Greek fire projectors that could neutralize enemy naval opposition. Admiral John's coordination of this maritime force demonstrated the sophisticated logistical planning that characterized Justinian's military preparations, as the fleet carried not only immediate combat supplies, but also siege equipment, engineering tools, and provisions sufficient to sustain extended operations without dependence on local resources. The initial target selected for Byzantine operations revealed Belisarius's understanding that psychological impact could prove as valuable as military success in undermining Ostrogothic resistance. Sicily's strategic position controlling access to the central Mediterranean made it an obvious objective, but the island's predominantly Greek population and its historical connections to Byzantine culture suggested that conquest might be achieved with minimal resistance while providing a secure base for subsequent operations against the Italian mainland. The rapid capitulation of Sicilian strongholds during the summer of 535 AD confirmed these calculations, as local populations welcomed Byzantine forces as liberators rather than conquerors, while Gothic garrisons found themselves isolated and outnumbered. The siege of Syracuse demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Belisarius had developed through his African campaigns. As Byzantine forces employed coordinated land and sea attacks that prevented effective Gothic resistance while minimizing damage to urban infrastructure that would be valuable for subsequent administrative purposes. The city's massive fortifications, constructed during the classical period and reinforced by successive rulers, required systematic reduction using siege engines that combined traditional Roman engineering with innovations learned through warfare against Persian and barbarian opponents. Gothic defenders, commanded by experienced officers who understood the strategic importance of maintaining control over Sicily's largest port, mounted determined resistance that tested Byzantine capabilities while providing valuable intelligence about enemy tactical methods and equipment standards. The fall of Syracuse after a siege of barely 3 weeks revealed the extent to which Gothic defensive preparations had been compromised by the political instabilities that followed Amalasuntha's assassination. The garrison's surrender negotiations, conducted through intermediaries who emphasized the futility of continued resistance against overwhelming Byzantine superiority, reflected broader demoralization within Gothic military ranks as news of defeat spread throughout territories under Ostrogothic control. The generous terms offered to surrendering defenders, including safe passage to the mainland and retention of personal property, demonstrated Belisarius's sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare methods that could encourage similar capitulations at other defensive positions. The conquest of southern Italy proceeded with remarkable speed as Byzantine forces exploited the advantages gained through their Sicilian success, while Gothic defensive arrangements collapsed under the pressure of coordinated attacks supported by local populations who viewed imperial restoration as preferable to continued barbarian rule. The port cities of Reggio and Brindisi surrendered without serious resistance as their predominantly Greek inhabitants opened their gates to Byzantine forces, providing secure bases for further operations while demonstrating the extent to which ethnic and religious divisions within Italian society could be exploited by skilled military commanders. The capture of these strategic positions effectively severed communications between Gothic forces in different regions while providing Belisarius with multiple options for subsequent campaigns. The advance toward Naples brought Byzantine forces into contact with more substantial Gothic resistance, as Theodahad's government recognised that the loss of this crucial port would threaten the entire kingdom's defensive strategy. The city's position controlling access to the Tyrrhenian Sea made it an essential link in the supply chains that sustained Gothic military operations throughout central Italy. While its formidable fortifications and experienced garrison commanded by Conon presented the first serious test of Byzantine siege capabilities since the African campaigns. The Gothic commander's decision to defend Naples reflected both strategic necessity and personal honour, as surrender would have exposed the entire western coast to Byzantine naval operations while destroying his own reputation among warrior followers who expected courageous resistance regardless of tactical circumstances. The siege of Naples, beginning in November 536 AD, revealed the methodical approach that characterized Belisarius's military operations, as Byzantine engineers systematically reduced the city's defensive capabilities while maintaining pressure that prevented effective relief operations. The investment of the city required complex coordination between land forces that controlled overland approaches and naval units that blockaded the harbour, creating a comprehensive isolation that gradually exhausted the defenders' resources while preventing communication with potential reinforcements. Gothic attempts to break the siege through sorties against Byzantine siege works demonstrated determined resistance, but lacked the coordination and tactical sophistication necessary to achieve decisive results against disciplined imperial troops. The innovative siege techniques employed by Byzantine engineers during the Naples operations demonstrated the technological advantages that imperial forces possessed over their Gothic opponents. The construction of underground tunnels that approached the city's walls from concealed positions required engineering skills that few contemporary armies could match, while the deployment of torsion artillery capable of breaching massive stone fortifications provided firepower that Gothic defenders could not effectively counter. These technological disparities reflected broader differences in military organisation and resource allocation, as the Byzantine Empire's centralised administrative systems could concentrate specialised capabilities that individual barbarian kingdoms could not replicate. The capture of Naples on December 536 AD through a coordinated assault that combined tunnel operations with direct attacks against weakened wall sections demonstrated the effectiveness of Byzantine combined arms tactics, while providing psychological advantages that would influence subsequent operations. The city's fall after a siege of barely 6 weeks shocked Gothic military commanders, who had expected much longer resistance from such a strongly fortified position, while the generous treatment accorded to the civilian population encouraged other Italian cities to consider surrender rather than face similar siege operations. The speed of the victory also provided Belisarius with additional time to prepare for more challenging operations against targets that would be more heavily defended and strategically important. The march on Rome represented the culmination of Belisarius's initial campaign strategy, as control of the ancient capital would provide both symbolic legitimacy and practical advantages for subsequent operations throughout the Italian peninsula. The city's massive population of approximately 100,000 inhabitants and its complex urban geography presented unique challenges for both attackers and defenders, while its historical significance ensured that the battle for Rome would be closely observed by audiences throughout the Mediterranean world. Gothic preparations for defending the city reflected Theodahad's recognition that the loss of Rome would effectively end any credible claims to legitimate authority over Italian territories. The Gothic evacuation of Rome on December 9th, 536 AD, following Theodahad's deposition and replacement by Vitiges, demonstrated the extent to which political instabilities had undermined effective military resistance to Byzantine advances. The new Gothic king's decision to withdraw his forces to more defensible positions around Ravenna reflected sound strategic thinking, as Rome's extensive urban area could not be effectively defended by the limited troops available, while the city's supply requirements would strain Gothic logistical capabilities. However, the abandonment of the ancient capital without a major battle represented a significant psychological defeat that encouraged further defections from Gothic cause, while providing Belisarius with a prestigious victory that enhanced his reputation throughout the empire. The triumphal entry of Byzantine forces into Rome marked the symbolic restoration of imperial authority over territories that had been lost to barbarian control for over 60 years. Belisarius's ceremonial procession through the ancient streets, accompanied by his veteran troops displaying the standards that had conquered African Sicily, provided powerful visual evidence of imperial resurgence, while demonstrating to Roman populations that effective protection was available under Byzantine rule. The general's respectful treatment of Catholic religious authorities and his immediate attention to urban food supplies created favourable impressions that facilitated the transition from Gothic to imperial administration. The defensive preparations that Vitiges implemented around Ravenna during the winter of 536-537 AD reflected his understanding that Gothic survival depended on creating strategic depth that could absorb Byzantine advances while providing time for diplomatic initiatives that might alter the military balance. The new king's extensive fortification of positions throughout the Po Valley created multiple defensive lines that would force Belisarius to conduct time-consuming siege operations, while Gothic forces retained mobility advantages in familiar terrain. These preparations demonstrated sophisticated military planning that drew upon decades of experience in Italian warfare, while adapting traditional Germanic defensive concepts to the specific geographical conditions of northern Italy. The siege of Rome that began in March 537 AD represented Vitiges' most ambitious attempt to reverse Byzantine gains through concentrated military action that would demonstrate Gothic resilience, while potentially encouraging support from external allies. The Gothic army that invested the ancient capital numbered approximately 50,000 warriors drawn from throughout the kingdom's territories, representing the largest military force that any barbarian ruler had assembled for operations against imperial troops. The siege's duration and intensity would test both armies' endurance, while providing definitive evidence about the relative capabilities of Gothic and Byzantine military systems. The Gothic siege works constructed around Rome demonstrated engineering capabilities that rivaled contemporary Byzantine standards, while revealing the extent to which barbarian armies had adapted Roman military techniques to their own strategic requirements. The 7 fortified camps positioned at key points around the city's perimeter created a comprehensive investment that blocked major roads while providing secure bases for sustained operations. Each camp featured timber palisades reinforced with earthworks and equipped with artillery positions that could interdict Byzantine supply convoys while protecting Gothic forces from counterattacks launched from the city's walls. The assault on the Salarian Gate on March 21st, 537 AD, marked the most intensive phase of the Gothic siege, as Vitiges concentrated his forces against what appeared to be the weakest section of Rome's defensive perimeter. The coordinated attack employed siege towers, battering rams, and concentrated archery fire in an attempt to create breaches that could be exploited by massed infantry assault, while Gothic cavalry units positioned themselves to intercept any Byzantine relief efforts. The day-long battle tested both armies' tactical capabilities while providing clear evidence about the effectiveness of different military technologies and organisational methods. The failure of the Gothic assault revealed critical weaknesses in barbarian siege techniques, while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of Roman defensive engineering when properly implemented. Byzantine defenders, commanded by officers experienced in siege warfare from the African campaigns, employed coordinated artillery fire and disciplined infantry counterattacks that prevented Gothic forces from establishing permanent footholds on the city's walls. The defeat forced Vitiges to reconsider his strategic approach, while providing Belisarius with opportunities to launch offensive operations that could exploit Gothic demoralization and tactical confusion. The protracted siege of Rome gradually evolved into a war of attrition that tested both Gothic endurance and Byzantine resourcefulness, as the conflict stretched through the scorching summer months of 537 AD into the following winter. Vitiges had transformed his initial assault strategy into a systematic blockade designed to starve the city into submission, while his engineers constructed increasingly sophisticated siege works that demonstrated the military knowledge Gothic forces had accumulated through decades of warfare against imperial opponents. The massive timber towers that rose outside Rome's walls incorporated innovations learned from Roman military manuals, featuring multiple artillery platforms and protected approaches that allowed Gothic archers to maintain suppressive fire against Byzantine defenders, while siege engines methodically weakened the ancient fortifications. Byzantine countermeasures revealed Belisarius's tactical flexibility as he adapted his limited forces to meet threats that significantly outnumbered his available troops. The general's decision to launch coordinated sorties against Gothic siege positions demonstrated his understanding that passive defence would eventually succumb to the overwhelming numerical superiority that Vitiges had assembled around the city. These carefully planned attacks, typically conducted during the pre-dawn hours when Gothic sentries were least alert, employed small units of heavily armed infantry supported by mounted archers, whose mobility allowed rapid withdrawal before enemy reinforcements could respond effectively. The psychological impact of these operations proved as valuable as their tactical results, as repeated successful raids undermined Gothic confidence while demonstrating to Roman civilians that their Byzantine protectors possessed both the capability and determination to maintain active resistance. The supply situation within besieged Rome created complex logistical challenges that required innovative solutions, drawing upon both military expertise and civilian cooperation. Belisarius had inherited a city whose normal food supplies depended on regular shipments from throughout the Italian peninsula, but the Gothic blockade had severed most overland transportation routes, while naval operations remained limited by the small size of the Byzantine fleet available for Italian operations. The general's response involved implementing rationing systems that prioritized military personnel, while maintaining civilian morale through equitable distribution of available resources. Underground storage facilities constructed during the imperial period provided secure repositories for accumulated supplies, while systematic inventory management ensured efficient utilization of finite resources during the extended siege period. The arrival of reinforcements under John the Bloodthirsty in late 537 AD marked a crucial turning point in the siege, as additional Byzantine troops provided Belisarius with offensive capabilities that had been impossible with his original limited forces. The new contingent included 1,600 cavalry, drawn from Imperial Guard units, whose equipment and training represented the highest standards of contemporary military professionalism, while their commander brought extensive experience from Persian frontier campaigns. where mobile warfare tactics had proven decisive against numerically superior opponents. The integration of these fresh troops into existing defensive arrangements required careful coordination to maximize their impact while maintaining the established patterns of siege operations that had successfully frustrated Gothic assault attempts. John's cavalry raids against Gothic supply lines demonstrated the vulnerability of Vitiges' extended siege positions to attacks by disciplined mobile forces operating from secure bases within the city. These operations, conducted with the systematic efficiency that characterized elite imperial units, targeted the wagon trains and livestock herds that sustained the massive Gothic army, while avoiding direct confrontation with main enemy formations that could overwhelm the relatively small raiding forces. The cumulative impact of these attacks gradually weakened Gothic logistical capabilities, while forcing Vitiges to divert substantial numbers of warriors from siege operations to protect his increasingly vulnerable supply arrangements. The construction of the Milvian Bridge fortification by Gothic engineers represented their most ambitious attempt to create permanent siege infrastructure that could maintain the blockade indefinitely while providing secure positions for continued military operations. This massive earthwork complex, positioned to control the vital crossing point over the Tiber River, incorporated multiple defensive lines with integrated artillery positions and underground storage facilities that could sustain a substantial garrison through extended periods. The engineering expertise required for this construction project demonstrated the sophisticated military capabilities that Gothic armies had developed, while the project's scale revealed Vitiges' determination to achieve decisive victory regardless of the time and resources required. Byzantine efforts to disrupt the bridge fortification led to some of the most intense fighting of the entire siege, as Belisarius recognized that Gothic control of this strategic position would effectively seal Rome's isolation from potential relief forces. The series of night attacks launched against the construction works employed specialized assault troops equipped with incendiary devices and siege equipment designed to destroy enemy engineering projects before they could be completed. These dangerous operations required exceptional coordination and timing, as attacking forces had to approach heavily defended positions across open terrain while carrying bulky equipment that limited their mobility and increased their vulnerability to Gothic missile fire. The battle for the Milvian Bridge on December 17th, 537 AD, represented the climactic engagement of the siege, as both armies committed substantial forces to a confrontation that would determine the strategic balance for subsequent operations. Gothic defenders, commanded by experienced officers who understood the position's critical importance, had prepared elaborate defensive arrangements, including concealed archery positions, mobile barriers that could channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, and reserve formations positioned to launch counterattacks against any Byzantine breakthrough attempts. The fortification's design incorporated lessons learned from previous siege warfare, while adapting traditional Germanic defensive concepts to the specific geographical features of the Tiber crossing. Belisarius' assault plan demonstrated the tactical sophistication that had characterized his most successful operations, combining diversionary attacks against secondary objectives with concentrated force applied at carefully selected breakthrough points. The main attack force, composed of his most experienced infantry supported by John's cavalry units, approached the bridge fortifications under cover of darkness, while auxiliary forces created noise and confusion at distant positions to mask the primary assault's approach. The coordination required for this complex operation tested Byzantine command capabilities, while revealing the extent to which imperial military doctrine had evolved to incorporate lessons learned from warfare against diverse opponents throughout the empire's extensive frontiers. The Gothic resistance to the Byzantine assault revealed both the strengths and limitations of barbarian military organisation when confronted with disciplined imperial forces employing coordinated tactical methods. Individual Gothic warriors demonstrated the personal courage and combat skills that had enabled their ancestors' conquest of Italy, fighting with traditional longswords and broad-bladed spears that could inflict devastating casualties in close-quarters combat. However, the lack of systematic coordination between different units and the absence of standardized command procedures created vulnerabilities that experienced Byzantine officers could exploit through precise timing and concentrated application of force at critical moments. The breakthrough achieved by John's cavalry at the bridge's northern approach demonstrated the decisive impact that superior tactical mobility could achieve against static defensive positions. The mounted archers' ability to provide suppressive fire while maintaining movement allowed them to neutralize Gothic archery positions that had been designed to counter infantry assault, while their rapid advance prevented enemy reserves from organizing effective counterattacks. The psychological shock of seeing their strongest defensive position penetrated by a relatively small force contributed to the collapse of Gothic resistance, as individual warriors began abandoning their positions rather than face encirclement by rapidly advancing Byzantine forces. The aftermath of the Milvian Bridge victory provided Belisarius with strategic advantages that extended far beyond the immediate tactical success, as news of the defeat spread throughout Gothic territories and encouraged defections from Vitiges' cause. The capture of the bridge position opened direct communication routes between Rome and Byzantine forces operating in other regions of Italy, while the substantial quantities of equipment and supplies abandoned by retreating Gothic forces provided valuable resources for subsequent operations. More importantly, the visible demonstration of Byzantine military superiority undermined Gothic morale throughout the kingdom, while encouraging Italian populations to view imperial restoration as inevitable rather than merely possible. The gradual disintegration of the Gothic siege during the early months of 538 AD reflected the cumulative impact of military defeats, supply shortages, and declining morale that had progressively weakened Vitiges' position. Individual Gothic commanders began negotiating separate arrangements with Byzantine forces rather than continuing hopeless resistance, while entire military units abandoned their siege positions to return to their home territories where local security concerns took precedence over kingdom-wide strategic objectives. The systematic collapse of Gothic military discipline demonstrated the extent to which barbarian armies depended on continuous success to maintain unit cohesion and command authority. Vitiges' decision to abandon the siege and withdraw to Ravenna in March 538 AD marked the effective end of Gothic offensive capabilities against Byzantine forces, while initiating a new phase of the war characterized by defensive operations from fortified positions throughout northern Italy. The Gothic king's retreat, conducted with considerable skill despite the demoralized condition of his forces, preserved substantial military assets while establishing defensive positions that could potentially sustain prolonged resistance. The withdrawal route through the Apennine Mountains provided natural obstacles that limited Byzantine pursuit while allowing Gothic forces to maintain organizational integrity despite their recent defeats. The liberation of Rome after a siege lasting over a year provided Belisarius with both symbolic victory and practical advantages for subsequent military operations throughout the Italian peninsula. The general's triumphal celebration, conducted with appropriate ceremony but avoiding excessive displays that might alienate Italian populations, demonstrated Byzantine respect for Roman traditions while proclaiming imperial authority over territories that had been lost to barbarian control for decades. The restoration of normal urban life, including the resumption of commercial activities and religious observances, created favourable conditions for Byzantine administration while providing evidence of imperial commitment to Italian welfare. The strategic situation that emerged following the end of the siege revealed both the extent of Byzantine achievements and the challenges that remained for complete conquest of the Ostrogothic kingdom. Imperial forces now controlled most of central and southern Italy, including the symbolically crucial city of Rome, while maintaining secure communication lines with Constantinople through naval operations in the Adriatic Sea. However, Gothic resistance remained substantial in northern territories where Vitigis had established defensive positions that could potentially sustain prolonged warfare, while the limited size of Byzantine forces available for Italian operations created constraints on the speed with which final victory could be achieved. The administrative arrangements that Belisarius implemented in conquered territories demonstrated his understanding that military success required effective civilian governance to achieve lasting political control. The restoration of traditional Roman legal procedures and tax collection systems provided familiar frameworks for Italian populations while ensuring adequate revenue streams to support continued military operations. Byzantine administrators, many of whom had gained experience in the recently conquered African provinces, adapted imperial bureaucratic methods to Italian conditions while respecting local customs and privileges that had developed during the Gothic period. The recruitment of Italian personnel for both military and administrative positions reflected Byzantine recognition that permanent control required local cooperation and participation rather than simple occupation by external forces. Roman nobles who had served under Gothic rule were offered opportunities to continue their careers under imperial authority, while urban populations were encouraged to resume normal commercial and professional activities that had been disrupted by prolonged warfare. These policies created stakeholder groups whose interests aligned with continued Byzantine control while providing practical expertise that imperial administrators could not have supplied independently. The fortification of key strategic positions throughout Byzantine-controlled territory revealed Belisarius's awareness that Gothic counterattacks remained possible despite recent defeats. The systematic strengthening of defensive works at Rome, Naples, and other major cities provided secure bases for imperial forces while creating obstacles that would complicate any future Gothic offensive operations. These engineering projects employed both Roman construction techniques and innovations developed through recent siege warfare experience, creating defensive systems that incorporated lessons learned from the extended conflict while adapting to the specific geographical and tactical conditions of Italian warfare. The emergence of Totila as a significant Gothic military leader during this period represented a new phase in barbarian resistance that would test Byzantine consolidation efforts throughout the peninsula. Unlike the previous generation of Gothic commanders who had relied primarily on traditional Germanic warfare methods, Totila demonstrated tactical flexibility and strategic vision that incorporated lessons learned from recent defeats while exploiting the vulnerabilities that extended Byzantine supply lines created. His ability to organize effective resistance from limited resources while maintaining Gothic morale despite previous setbacks would prove crucial for the kingdom's survival during the challenging years ahead. The guerrilla warfare tactics that characterized Gothic operations under Totila's leadership represented a significant evolution from the conventional military methods that had dominated earlier phases of the conflict. Rather than attempting to match Byzantine forces in direct confrontation, where imperial advantages in equipment, training and coordination were most pronounced, Gothic forces began employing hit-and-run attacks against isolated enemy positions, while avoiding major battles that could result in decisive defeats. These tactics required different organizational structures and command methods than traditional Germanic warfare, but they proved effective in disrupting Byzantine administrative arrangements while preserving Gothic military assets for future operations. The Siege of Florence in late 538 AD demonstrated Totila's sophisticated understanding of siege warfare techniques while revealing the extent to which Gothic military capabilities had evolved through their conflict with imperial forces. The systematic investment of this strategically important city employed engineering methods that rivaled Byzantine standards, including the construction of elaborate siege works and the deployment of artillery equipment that had been captured from previous imperial positions. The coordination required for these complex operations demonstrated that Gothic forces had developed organisational capabilities that enabled sustained military projects requiring precise timing and resource allocation. The collapse of the Ostrogothic kingdom in 553 AD, following Totila's death at the Battle of Taginai, did not erase the profound transformations that Gothic rule had wrought across the Italian peninsula during its 6 decades of dominance. The administrative systems, legal frameworks, and cultural syntheses that had emerged under Theodoric the Great continued to influence European development long after the last Gothic strongholds had fallen to Byzantine forces. The preservation of Roman governmental structures through the turbulent transition period of the 5th and early 6th centuries created institutional continuities that would prove essential for the subsequent development of medieval European political organisation, while the cultural exchanges facilitated by Gothic patronage established intellectual traditions that shaped European learning for centuries. The legal legacy of Ostrogothic rule extended far beyond the territorial boundaries of the former kingdom, as the principle of personality of law that had governed Gothic Italy provided a model for managing ethnic diversity within unified political structures. The sophisticated arrangements that had allowed Romans to live under Roman law, while Goths followed Germanic customs, all under unified royal authority, offered practical solutions to challenges that would confront numerous medieval kingdoms dealing with ethnically diverse populations. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain adopted similar legal frameworks, while Frankish rulers incorporated elements of Gothic administrative methods into their own governmental systems. The Edictum Theodorici, with its careful balance between Germanic legal concepts emphasizing personal honour and Roman principles focusing on state authority, influenced the development of legal codes throughout barbarian Europe. The preservation of Roman administrative expertise through Gothic patronage proved crucial for the survival of governmental techniques that would otherwise have been lost during the political upheavals of the post-imperial period. The bureaucratic methods that Cassiodorus and other Roman administrators had refined under Gothic rule provided templates for medieval European governments that lacked the institutional knowledge necessary to manage complex territorial states. The tax collection systems, judicial procedures, and diplomatic protocols that had operated successfully in Ostrogothic Italy were studied and adapted by subsequent rulers who recognised their effectiveness in governing diverse populations while maintaining political stability. The cultural synthesis achieved under Gothic rule created intellectual traditions that profoundly influenced the development of medieval European learning and artistic expression. The preservation of classical texts through Gothic patronage ensured that essential works of literature, philosophy, and technical knowledge survived the political disruptions that destroyed many other repositories of ancient learning. The scriptoriums established at institutions like Cassiodorus's vivarium continued operating long after the fall of the Gothic kingdom, their copying workshops producing manuscripts that transmitted classical knowledge to medieval scholars throughout Europe. The educational methods developed in Gothic Italy, which combined traditional Roman pedagogical approaches with practical training in governmental administration, provided models for medieval schools that needed to prepare students for careers in increasingly complex political environments. The architectural innovations that emerged during the Gothic period established design principles and construction techniques that influenced European building traditions for centuries. The synthesis of Germanic decorative preferences with Roman engineering capabilities created distinctive artistic styles that appeared in churches, palaces, and public buildings throughout medieval Europe. The mausoleum of Theodoric in Ravenna, with its unique combination of classical proportions and barbarian symbolic elements, inspired similar projects in other kingdoms where rulers sought to proclaim their legitimacy through monumental architecture that respected both Germanic traditions and Roman imperial precedents. The construction techniques developed for these projects including innovations in stone cutting, metalworking, and decorative arts, were transmitted through craftsmen who carried their skills to new locations as political circumstances changed. The religious policies that had maintained stability in Gothic Italy provided precedents for managing theological diversity within medieval European kingdoms that contained multiple Christian communities with different doctrinal commitments. The principle of religious tolerance that Theodoric had implemented, allowing both Arian and Catholic Christians to practice their respective beliefs without governmental interference, offered practical solutions to problems that would confront numerous medieval rulers dealing with religious minorities. The careful balance between royal authority and ecclesiastical independence that had characterized Gothic-Catholic relations influenced the development of church-state relationships throughout medieval Europe, particularly in kingdoms where rulers needed to maintain cooperation with religious communities that possessed different theological commitments. The diplomatic methods that Gothic rulers had employed in managing relationships with other barbarian kingdoms established precedents for international relations that continued to influence European politics long after the kingdom's fall. The marriage alliance systems that had linked the Ostrogothic royal house with Frankish, Burgundian, Vandal, and Visigothic dynasties created kinship networks that transcended ethnic boundaries, while providing mechanisms for resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than warfare. These diplomatic traditions influenced the development of medieval European international law, particularly the concepts of dynastic legitimacy and territorial sovereignty that would govern relationships between emerging nation-states. The military innovations that had characterized Gothic armies, particularly their integration of traditional Germanic warrior traditions with Roman tactical methods and steppe warfare techniques learned during the Hunnic period, influenced the development of medieval European military organization. The combined arms formations that Gothic commanders had perfected, employing heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, and mobile archery units in coordinated battlefield operations, provided models for medieval armies that needed to adapt to changing tactical environments. The siege warfare techniques that Gothic engineers had developed, combining traditional Roman engineering methods with innovations learned through extended campaigns, contributed to the evolution of medieval military technology. The economic systems that had flourished under Gothic rule, particularly the commercial networks that had connected Italian production centres with markets throughout the Mediterranean basin, established trade relationships that continued to influence European economic development after the kingdom's political collapse. The standardization of weights, measures, and monetary systems that Gothic administrators had implemented provided frameworks for commercial exchanges that facilitated long-distance trade even during periods of political instability. The agricultural improvements that had been introduced in Gothic territories, including new cultivation techniques and crop varieties, contributed to the gradual recovery of European agricultural productivity that would support population growth during the medieval period. The intellectual achievements of scholars like Boethius and Cassiodorus, supported by Gothic royal patronage, created philosophical and theological frameworks that profoundly influenced medieval European thought. Boethius's translations of Aristotelian logical works provided medieval scholars with their primary access to Greek philosophical methods, while his synthesis of classical reasoning with Christian doctrine established intellectual approaches that dominated European universities for centuries. His Consolation of Philosophy, written during his imprisonment before execution, became one of the most widely read works in medieval Europe, its exploration of divine providence and human free will influencing generations of theologians and philosophers. Cassiodorus's educational theories and institutional innovations provided blueprints for medieval European schools and universities that needed to preserve classical learning while adapting it to Christian educational goals. His systematic approach to manuscript preservation and copying established methods that ensured the survival of essential classical texts. Through the political upheavals of the early medieval period, the library classification system he developed influenced the organisation of medieval European book collections, while his integration of secular and religious learning created educational curricula that balance practical training with theoretical knowledge. The historical narratives produced by Gothic and Roman authors during the kingdom's existence provided medieval European chroniclers with models for writing about barbarian peoples and their relationships with classical civilization. Jordanes's Getica, based largely on Cassiodorus's lost Gothic history, established historiographical traditions that influenced medieval European understanding of Germanic peoples and their role in the transformation of the Roman world. These works create interpretive frameworks that portrayed barbarian kingdoms as legitimate successors to Roman imperial authority, rather than simply destructive forces, contributing to medieval European concepts of political continuity and dynastic legitimacy. The archaeological evidence preserved from Ostrogothic sites continues to provide insights into the material culture and daily life of early medieval European societies. The distinctive artistic styles that emerge from the fusion of Germanic, Roman and Byzantine influences can be traced in artifact assemblages throughout medieval Europe, demonstrating the widespread influence of cultural patterns that had originated in Gothic Italy. The technological innovations preserved in Gothic metalwork, jewellery and decorative arts influenced European craftsmanship for centuries. Their techniques transmitted through artisan networks that connected different regions of the continent. Modern historiographical debates about the nature of the Ostrogothic kingdom and its place in European development reflect broader scholarly discussions about the transformation of the Roman world and the emergence of medieval European civilization. The traditional narrative that portrayed barbarian invasions as destructive forces that ended classical civilization has been largely replaced by more nuanced interpretations that emphasize cultural continuity and creative synthesis. Scholars like Patrick Geary and Walter Pole have demonstrated that barbarian kingdoms like the Ostrogothic realm represented innovative attempts to create new forms of political organisation that could govern ethnically diverse populations while preserving essential elements of classical culture. The question of Ostrogothic ethnic identity has become particularly important in contemporary scholarly discussions about the nature of early medieval European societies. Rather than viewing the Ostrogoths as a distinct tribal group with fixed cultural characteristics, modern historians increasingly understand Gothic identity as a fluid political and cultural construct that could incorporate diverse populations under unified leadership. This perspective emphasizes the role of royal ideology and military organization in creating group identities that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries, suggesting that barbarian kingdoms represented innovative political experiments rather than simple extensions of tribal societies. The debate about the relationship between barbarian kingdoms and the Roman Empire has evolved significantly as scholars have gained better understanding of the complex negotiations and accommodations that characterized interactions between Germanic rulers and imperial authorities. Rather than viewing the Ostrogothic kingdom as simply a rebellion against Roman authority, contemporary historians recognize it as part of a broader transformation of imperial structures that involved both continuity and innovation. The Gothic rulers' claims to exercise authority on behalf of the Eastern Roman Empire, combined with their practical independence in governing Italian territories, represented creative solutions to the challenges of maintaining political control over vast territories with limited administrative resources. The role of the Ostrogothic kingdom in facilitating cultural exchange between Eastern and Western Europe has gained increased scholarly attention as historians have recognised the importance of barbarian courts as centres of intellectual activity. The Gothic court at Ravenna served as a crucial intermediary between Byzantine and Western European intellectual traditions, providing a venue where scholars from different cultural backgrounds could collaborate on projects that preserved and transmitted classical learning. This cultural bridging function proved essential for maintaining intellectual continuity during the political fragmentation that characterized the post-imperial period. The influence of Ostrogothic Italy on the development of medieval European political structures continues to be debated among scholars who recognize both the kingdom's innovations and its limitations. The Gothic synthesis of Germanic warrior traditions with Roman administrative methods provided models for subsequent medieval kingdoms, but the ultimate failure to create stable institutional arrangements that could survive dynastic crises also demonstrated the challenges involved in governing ethnically diverse societies. The lessons learned from Gothic successes and failures influenced the political development of medieval European kingdoms that face similar challenges in balancing competing cultural traditions while maintaining effective governmental control. The Ostrogothic legacy in European art and architecture remains visible in surviving monuments and in the stylistic influences that can be traced through medieval European artistic traditions. The distinctive polychrome jewellery tradition that flourished under Gothic patronage influenced decorative arts throughout medieval Europe, while the architectural innovations developed in Gothic Italy contributed to the evolution of medieval European building techniques. The synthesis of classical and barbarian artistic elements that characterized Ostrogothic material culture provided models for medieval European artists who needed to create works that appealed to audiences with diverse cultural backgrounds. The ultimate significance of the Ostrogothic kingdom lies not in its military conquests or political achievements, but in its demonstration that creative cultural synthesis could produce innovative solutions to the challenges of governing complex societies during periods of political transformation. The Gothic success in preserving essential elements of Roman civilization while adapting them to new political and social circumstances provided a crucial bridge between the classical and medieval worlds, ensuring that valuable intellectual, administrative, and artistic traditions survived the upheavals of the post-imperial period. Though the kingdom itself lasted barely 6 decades, its influence on European development continued for centuries, shaping the political, cultural, and intellectual foundations of medieval European civilization in ways that remain visible to contemporary scholars and continue to inform our understanding of this crucial period in European history.